Washington, D.C., where Antoinette Davis graduates from Eastern Senior High in the late 1970s. 10 years later, her high school reunion is a trip down memory lane, a chance to see old friends.
Excuse me.
And make new ones.
You're Antoinette, right?
And who might you be?
Antoinette is 28 years old and newly divorced with a 6-year-old daughter, Monique.
My mother was very beautiful. She was very pretty. She had pretty eyes and she was very attractive.
To Antoinette, back in high school, fellow student Spencer Chase was just another face in the hall. Not anymore.
Spencer Chase, man. At your service.
Oh, you're so sweet. Do I know you from somewhere?
From a long time ago.
They were working on their class reunion, and they were both on the committee, but apparently they had never been introduced.
This is Spencer Jr. He's 10.
Oh, he's so handsome. That's my baby girl, Monique. The sitter canceled on me at the last minute.
She's so beautiful.
They bond over the fact that they're both divorced with young children.
I see where she gets her good looks.
Oh, you're such a flirt. Too much.
Spencer's a charmer and asks her out. But Antoinette is reluctant to take it any further.
She told me about this, and I said, okay, well, what's the deal? Why aren't you willing? And she says, well, once you see him, you'll understand my reluctance. He's really a big guy.
But Spencer won't take no for an answer. He keeps calling, and Antoinette finally decides to give him a shot.
He was a gentleman when he was courting her, and I think it was that demeanor that attracted her more so to him.
When he's not busy courting Antoinette, Spencer's an administrator and maintenance man at a nearby nursing home.
Fred, stop going through my locker and eating my food. Buy your own food.
You know, you could stand to lose a couple pounds.
I heard that.
His colleagues at the nursing home enjoyed his personality and they enjoyed being around him.
He was just a loving person. Everybody in the building liked him.
It was fun. You know, it was a fun job. I think he really enjoyed it.
His wages are modest, but the work is steady, and Spencer is generous.
Every time I seen them, they was always doing something as a couple, going out with one another, church events.
Mostly, he treated her during the early part of the courtship.
Which is fortunate, because Antoinette's salary as an administrator can't cover all the things they like to do.
They like to take cruises. They like to go out of town to the casino, going away to the mountains. They just like to enjoy life.
Antoinette's daughter, Monique, and Spencer's son, Spencer Jr., make it an even 4.
He was just willing to almost bend over backwards to ensure that she was happy and I was happy.
They did a lot of family things together. I know family was very important to her, that dynamic.
Oh, man.
They were very close.
Go ahead, baby.
4 years into their relationship, it's time to make a commitment.
They went to the Justice of the Peace, and as far as the reception, they actually had a really big backyard barbecue and invited all their family and friends to celebrate.
She loved him. You know, she loved Monique, and she loved her stepson.
I mean, we had a really good life.
Psychotherapist Stacy Kaiser and forensic psychologist Brian Russell have high hopes for Maryland's newest married couple.
Antoinette and Spencer have really gone about it the right way. They took their time getting to know each other, and they took their time introducing the kids.
They had a 4-year courtship. They didn't just jump right in, certainly didn't jump right into living together and trying to blend households right away, as a lot of couples do.
And so that really sets up a quality future.
2 years after they say I do, Spencer and Antoinette are as happy as ever. And professionally, things couldn't be going better. At least for Antoinette, who has just landed a new job.
When they first met, Spencer earned more money than my mother. But Mommy started working in the federal government, and And because my mother was motivated and driven, she excelled quicker than he did.
Antoinette got promotions after promotions during her career.
Primarily because of the difference in the educational level. I don't believe Spencer had any college, and Antoinette did.
Her salary is now double his.
You go have some fun with this, baby.
You know we make a great team.
You know we do.
She was the primary wage earner in our household, which allowed us to have a nice, comfortable lifestyle.
After paying rent for years, Spencer and Antoinette buy a house together in a well-to-do new development in the suburb of Hyattsville, Maryland.
Maybe what I tell you.
Everything was new. It was big.
Look at this.
It was pretty. It was a nice house.
How happy are you?
Really happy.
That's not all the Chases enjoy.
Spencer, he dressed very nice. Suits, gator shoes.
Big guy, very spiffy dresser. He loved clothes, and he looked good in what he wore.
Antoinette's no penny pincher either.
Well-dressed all the time, well-groomed, made sure her hair was done, her makeup was done, and her nails, both hands and feet, were always done.
In 1998, Spencer's son, who's now 19, moves out to live on his own. With one less mouth to feed, Spencer and Antoinette have more disposable income than ever. But the more they make, the more they spend.
They had joint accounts. And on her paydays, he would go and withdraw large amounts of money, at least $400 to $500.
Yes, we're gonna have a good time tonight.
He didn't have a lot growing up, and he liked the status quo of seeming as though he was upper middle class and could afford the lifestyle and the luxuries.
And Antoinette's more than willing to be the provider.
Whatever she made, it was for the both of them. I didn't see it as a challenge. And she never expressed to me that it was a challenge.
Flowers for me. Thank you.
He was taking care of her in other ways.
Oh, they're gorgeous.
He was taking care of her heart. He was caring for her, loving her, being there for her.
While they appear to be thriving, the truth is, 5 years into their marriage, the Chases are living so large that their combined salaries, totaling more than $100,000, are barely enough to cover their lavish spending.
Are you kidding me?
She was the money maker, but I think he had a lot of say-so on where the money was spent, how it was directed.
He pretty much supposed to have been paying the bills, and the bills didn't get paid.
Spencer, I thought you paid the electricity bill.
I thought I did.
There have been times to which he said that things were cut off because he didn't pay it.
I could think of 1,000 things we can do.
You're so naughty.
She didn't want to make him feel as though he wasn't the man of the house.
She's not confrontational, assertive at all. Kind of just let's get along, let's not make a big deal of this. Whatever it takes for everybody to get along, that was Antoinette.
But deep down, Antoinette is starting to worry.
Where's all the money going? Withdrawal after withdrawal.
She definitely felt like he was now pulling his weight. He was satisfied with the way things were.
He needed to get a better job, he needed to make more money, and when you're the primary breadwinner, it can be stressful, and she tried to endure as best as she could.
Carrying the full load is tough, especially when it's dead weight.
He spent the entire check.
I just think it became overwhelming for her.
Spencer and Antoinette Chase have a loving marriage, a nice house, and a combined 6-figure income. But it's still not enough to bankroll their lifestyle. And when they stop paying bills, their facade of affluence crumbles.
What's going on?
Don't worry, baby.
What are these boxes for?
The bank foreclosed on us. We're gonna be staying with my aunt for a little while.
They lose the house.
I was maybe 17 or so when the house went into foreclosure, and it was fast.
When you're talking about the possibility of not having a roof over your head, that's very serious. Where do you go from there?
The Chases have to declare bankruptcy. Just when things appear at their bleakest, Antoinette and Spencer turn to their faith for solace.
Morning.
They both become pastors and vow to live more simply and to help others do the same.
They became more involved in the church, and they really took an active role and really desired to continue.
He was very inspirational to me. He was a good friend.
We come from a very religious family, and God is important, and we believe that what the Bible says you should do and how you should live is how she lived. They stayed with my Aunt Rena for a while, and then they were able to get out on their own and rent again.
The rent was really low in comparison to their house that they owned in Hyattsville.
She accepted that fact, that this is where they were at this time, and this is something that she was going to have to deal with.
We're $300 ahead. It's our best month ever.
That's right, Mama.
I think she had enough faith in him to think that he would do better because he, too, knew the financial situation that they were in.
Their new lifestyle pays off. After 2 years, the Chases have saved enough to purchase their second home. And it's even nicer than their first.
It was a good-sized house. It had 4 bedrooms. It was a nice home.
Spence! I got the job!
I knew you'd get the job!
2 years after that, Antoinette lands a better job.
Mommy was very driven, and she wanted to leave a legacy for her children. So she worked hard, and she always sought out to excel in her career.
But old habits die hard. The more Antoinette makes, the more Spencer spends.
He would like to pull it out, you know, to pay for things and all.
See you soon.
He was kind of like a showboat person. You know, he wanted to be the big man.
And the bigger the man, the bigger the car.
It's a Benz, brother. Of course it's got leather seats.
Spence, this car.
Hold on.
This car. How are we gonna pay for it? I mean, how are you gonna pay for it?
Baby, you got a good job. We'll be fine.
He liked the idea of impressing people, even if it was a false illusion. I think he thought, she's making enough, she can do this, let her do it.
Antoinette does her best to keep up appearances, even though inside she's falling apart.
I just think it became overwhelming for her in that she didn't see that he was trying to do anything to assist and make the matter better. Antoinette wasn't the type who would likely say, I really need help, this guy isn't carrying the weight. Rather than do that, she would hide it and work as many hours as she could.
Antoinette burns the midnight oil at work, but it's not just for the overtime.
She was trying to avoid him. She didn't want to be bothered with him.
When you've been allowing something for a long time and all of a sudden you're the one that puts on the brakes, it's really a potential for conflict. Puts her in a position where she feels like she has to be bossy or mothering or lecturing or overly responsible. And it puts him in a situation where he might feel resentful because of that.
Antoinette's telling Spencer there's a line and she's past it and that's it.
But Spencer's not just resentful.
What up, Spence?
He's also overwhelmed.
You all right, bro?
He did have a heart episode.
Go get a doctor!
It wasn't classified as a heart attack. It was just classified as a heart episode.
Spencer is admitted to the hospital, and doctors fear he could develop serious heart problems unless he takes on less physically demanding work.
The heart episode slowed him down, and after that happened, Mommy encouraged him to resign from the nursing home, from that maintenance position, and pursue a more laid-back career, so to speak.
A As luck would have it, a friend offers Spencer a job as a mortgage broker.
Still got it.
Antoinette is elated that Spencer's in a whole new league status-wise and sees it as a wonderful opportunity for them both. But when Spencer's first paycheck comes, he blows all of it on himself.
He actually threw himself a birthday party at our home, and he spent almost the entire check on the catering and decorations for the party at our house.
It was more important to him, I believe, to impress others as opposed to doing what was right in your own home.
Spencer! You told me that we can't afford to get my nails done, and you blow your wad on this?
Come on, what are you doing? We got guests.
Not my guests.
If you had a wife to make good money and you had full reign over the paycheck, then, you don't have to really work hard if you know you're going to have that income coming in steady.
After 2 years scraping by as a mortgage broker, Spencer calls it quits and goes back to his old job at the nursing home.
At that point, her salary was inching closer to 6 figures, whereas his was just barely above minimum wage.
Why, Spence? Why'd you quit your job?
I hated it. Ain't no sense in me doing a job I don't like.
Ain't no sense in me being with a man that can't provide.
Don't you start on me with that again.
So hopeless.
And with the old job comes a familiar problem.
They were so behind in so many things, it was even hard to just catch up.
By the way, the Benz is going back.
It's not going anywhere.
I paid for it. I'm the breadwinner. I decide. If you want to keep the car, then you go out and find a way to pay for it.
But if you don't change the behavior, the results will always be the same.
Mom, what is it? Mom.
She didn't understand why he wouldn't help her, why she has to do everything.
After 14 years of marriage, Antoinette makes the toughest decision of her life.
I think that she asked God, what can I do to make it better for myself and my child?
What's going on?
I'm leaving.
What?
I've had enough.
She just wanted to bring some peace and some harmony in her life.
Can we talk about this? Antoinette! Wait!
And he did have a tough time with that. And that's scary when you've been with someone for a long time and they make a decision to leave.
Something wrong, Antoinette?
Myself and Spence, we've separated.
What?
That kind of took me off guard because usually something like that, things are going on ahead of time and you may hear something negative or whatever, but I never did.
I thought everything was peaches and cream, I didn't have a clue that they was having any financial problems or any problems filed within their marriage.
Antoinette moves into a rental home in Springdale, Maryland, with her daughter, Monique.
It's like a breath of fresh air. It's like a burden's been lifted from her. She actually started to lose weight. I didn't realize how unhappy she was until I saw her happy again.
After she moves out, the Chase's second house goes into foreclosure because Spencer can't cover the mortgage.
At that point, he thought, I've got to do something, because he realized he couldn't even support himself. He needs her income to support himself.
All right.
Hey.
Give us a second, please. Thanks. Spencer, this is my job.
I brought you flowers.
Spencer, it's over.
One time he came and bought her flowers at work, and he wanted to take her on a date. And she was like, I'm not going on no date with him.
He was like stalking her.
Then, just 2 months after their separation, an ambulance is called to the Hyattsville house. Someone's in trouble.
It wasn't a typical attempt where you take a gun and pull the trigger or something along those lines.
She didn't want to have his blood on her hands.
Antoinette and Spencer Chase's marriage collapses under a mountain of debt, and their separation is a real killer. In September 2007, paramedics respond to a 911 call from Spencer.
His body was cool to the touch, and he actually had a little foam coming out of his mouth.
Luckily, there's still time. Spencer is rushed to the hospital.
He took an entire bottle of heart medicine that was designed to keep his heart rate steady. Would have stopped his heart had that medicine taken effect.
Antoinette races to his side.
I don't know what I was thinking.
Don't worry, baby. Just rest.
They had a discussion about how he was feeling, why he did what he did, and after so many years of them being together, he just doesn't know how to cope without her in his life. And she asked me how I felt about it if he came to live with us. And I felt for him. I felt sad. I mean, I didn't want him to die. He had been in my life since I was 6, so I loved him. She didn't want to have his blood on her hands, meaning that if he was to take his life and she could have prevented it in some way by being there for him, she wanted to do that.
But Antoinette seeks more than just her daughter's approval.
Their pastor had told her that she did not have any reason to leave her husband to seek a divorce from him.
Even with her faith and her heart telling her to take Spencer in, Antoinette still has doubts. Was Spencer truly suicidal?
It wasn't a typical attempt where you take a gun and pull the trigger or something along those lines. It was kind of a suicide attempt.
We decided that he wasn't really trying to kill himself. He was just trying to pull her back. I think he knew how to work her.
I can totally understand why Antoinette brought Spencer back into the house after his suicide attempt. She maybe thought that it would be a turning point where now he would put the family first in multiple ways, including financially.
And these two had already been divorced. There are kids in the picture. There are a lot of reasons to try to say, keep this relationship together.
At the same time, though, I think that she was probably making a big mistake. And the mistake was to let hugely manipulative behavior, like quasi-attempting suicide, be rewarded. If you let it work once, you're highly likely to have to deal with it again.
There needed to be some steps before that. There needed to be some healing between them before that. They should have focused on that instead of having her immediately move him back in.
Antoinette lays out new ground rules for their lives together.
That's for you. Things are gonna change around here.
Are you serious?
And Spencer doesn't like them.
When she took him back, she did not go back to the way things were before. She kept control of her own money.
He no longer had access to her money because, of course, him having access means that he can go and do whatever it is that he wanted to do.
But that's not all.
They weren't sleeping in the same bedroom anymore. And he didn't like that I was sleeping in the room with her because he felt like that was inhibiting their reconciliation.
Antoinette and Spencer had not been intimate for quite some time.
Antoinette's also working even longer hours than before, and Spencer wants to know why.
Have you seen my purse?
No, I didn't.
He started up his same old shenanigans again. He wanted to believe that she was seeing somebody else.
Spencer is so suspicious of Antoinette, any little thing could be proof that she's cheating, even a phone number he finds in her purse.
Look, it's right there.
Just losing my mind these days. Too much on my brain.
He decides to investigate.
Well, he had a friend at the police department that he actually contacted to pull phone records for him.
Appreciate it.
And he's shocked to discover Antoinette's been calling the mysterious number on a regular basis.
We started to see his jealous nature really come out.
Spencer! Hi, baby.
You miss these?
Spencer? You've been going through my stuff? Baby, these are for when I exercise, if you must know.
So why do you leave early then get home late?
I've got a lot of work to do.
Work, huh?
What's this?
Who you be calling?
What are you talking about? Spencer, it's just some guy. Some guy who's been helping me get through stuff.
She had male friends that she talked to, but they were just male friends.
What? You don't trust me?
I don't know. Can I?
Oh, Spencer, no, no.
She was very upset because she just didn't feel like he had any reason to feel as though she was cheating on him.
She was just at a breaking point.
With Spencer suspicious and Antoinette angry, something is about to blow.
This is definitely not a suicide. This is a suicide. How does the bag end up there?
If you find those, you'll find who did this.
Spencer, stop! Stop!
After years of financial problems, Antoinette and Spencer Chase's troubled marriage is hanging by a thread. And when Spencer accuses Antoinette of cheating on him, it's enough to make that thread snap.
It's over, Spence. We're through. I've thought about it, and I want you to leave.
Oh, come on, not this again.
Sunday morning, they were on their way to church, and he was driving, and she proceeded to tell him that she wanted him to leave.
Are you serious?
Yes. Yes. You need to leave.
She was very strong, and I think she was finding herself again, her voice.
Spencer, stop! Stop! Stop it.
The free ride is over. It's come to an end, and I don't think he liked it very much.
It's over.
Spencer reluctantly agrees to move out. But 2 days later, he's still there. For Antoinette, nothing has changed.
Bye, Mom.
Bye, baby. You look pretty today.
Typically, she went to work a little bit late. She left around 9:30 and got to work around 10 or so, and that was just her normal habit. That's the way she did it.
As a favor to Antoinette, Spencer starts her car to warm it up for her.
Spencer goes out and runs a couple errands. And the errands include going to PNC Bank, going to Burger King, and going to CVS.
By 10:30, Antoinette's late, and her co-workers are becoming concerned.
Usually she'll call me around 9:30. That didn't happen.
I had gone back to her desk like 2 or 3 times, and she wasn't there, and I started to get worried because the time was ticking away.
When Spencer returns home at 11:30, Antoinette's car is still in the driveway. The engine's running, exactly as he'd left it hours ago. He goes into the house, looking for Antoinette.
Antoinette!
Oh, no, 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 no!
Antoinette was found in the kitchen with the electrical cord close to her body.
911 emergency.
I need help. My wife, I think she hung herself.
Spencer was the 911 caller. He called stating that his wife was possibly deceased.
When I left her this morning, she was about to go to work. When I came home, I found her like that. I don't know what happened. She hung herself from the banister. I think she killed herself. I've been out all day running errands.
Detective Ben Brown arrives at the house soon after.
Antoinette Chase had already been transported to a local hospital, and Spencer Chase was actually leaving en route to the hospital. The garage door was in the up position, and then the entry door inside the garage was open. And when I walked in, I noticed there was a small pool of blood in the kitchen area close to an island, and an electrical cord lying on the floor.
As Detective Brown begins to investigate Antoinette's suicide, her family rushes to the hospital.
I got to the hospital emergency room, and the doctor said, your mom didn't make it. And I just remember screaming into my jacket. I just couldn't associate what it feels like to... I just saw her this morning, and now she's no more. I didn't even know what to do with myself at that point.
You're in a state of disbelief. It's like I just talked to Antoinette a couple of days before this. How is she dead? She wasn't ill. What happened?
No, she had no reason to kill herself. For what? She knew through her faith what that would mean.
She loved her life too much, and there were no signs that she was suicidal.
Antoinette was a good mom who cared a lot about her child, and so it is statistically rare for somebody like that to commit suicide.
She has been trying to make things better, trying to improve her financial situation. You know, she seems to be on the upward climb. Nothing that really looks like you would say this could have been something she would have done.
One thing I can tell you about suicide by hanging is that it's hard to fake. So we're gonna know pretty quickly when we really delve into that crime scene whether it was or it wasn't.
The investigators agree that suicide is highly unlikely.
Antoinette was about 180 pounds, and 180 pounds of dead weight is not going to be held by just anything. You need something sturdy to hold that. And there was no way that the wooden banister would have been able to sustain her weight.
The coroner said there was no way she could have hung herself because the markings would have been in a V shape to represent hanging, and hers were not. They were completely around her neck.
If it wasn't suicide, what happened?
Coffee, Miss Chase.
The police looked to Spencer Chase for answers.
And you say you were doing what again?
I went to the pharmacy. I grabbed something to eat. I was just running errands.
Okay. Is there any way you can prove that?
Yeah. I have the receipts on the counter at home.
He was very clear about the places he'd been and that something had happened to his wife while he was gone for about an hour.
Is there anything you can think of that happened that day? Or anything that was off, odd? Anything at all?
Wait. Come to think about it. The garage door was open.
He told me in so many words that he thought her purse was missing. He last saw it on a stool in their bedroom, along with her 2 phones. And he told me very specifically that if you find those, you'll find who did this.
Well, thank you for your time, Mr. Chase.
I can go?
Yes, you can.
Right away, I obtained a search warrant to be able to obtain cellular records to find the last locations of the phones.
Cell phones leave traces. You can use the cell towers to kind of retrace where the cell phone was potentially located.
The night of the incident, We were able to get the cell records back and determine the possible location for the phone, which was probably about 15 miles from the scene.
The next day, Detective Brown leads a search party through the area.
The area where we believe the phone to be was at the rear of a shopping center. There was a small pond and then a small creek that surrounded it, and then high grass and some wooded area.
He had police cadets to go to the area and walk it shoulder to shoulder, looking for the phone, and they couldn't find it.
I was very disappointed when we didn't locate it because I knew in the back of my mind that it was there.
Unwilling to let it go, Detective Brown returns 4 days later. Only 50 feet from the initial search area, he finds a series of storm drains. Armed only with a crowbar and a hunch, Detective Brown goes to work.
And so he goes, walks over to a storm drain, pops open the top, which isn't an easy endeavor by any means.
The first manhole I opened, there was nothing there. There was about 6 inches of water flowing through the manhole, some debris and things of that nature down there.
He pulls up a second, nothing. Then a third.
And that's when he kind of uncovers everything.
2 plastic grocery bags, half submerged in the murky water.
And once we opened the bags and pulled out the items, we discovered Antoinette's black purse. In the purse, her work ID, her driver's license, her wedding band, and a ring were in there. Both phones were located in that same bag.
It's clearly not a home invasion gone wrong.
If you're going to take the wedding rings, you take it to a pawn shop. You know, a robber isn't going to take the wedding rings and not try to pawn them.
But that's not all they recover from the storm drain.
Inside of the plastic bags, you find an extension cord similar to one that's found around the neck of Antoinette at the scene.
The chase is on.
This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing.
It just really angered me so much. She didn't deserve that.
Antoinette Chase's belongings are found in a storm drain, proof that her random murder is anything but. And in fact, all signs point to one person, her husband, Spencer.
There was actually a 5-pack of electrical cords in the house, and we were able to account for 4 of them in the home. And once we discovered the one in the sewer drain, we were able to account for all 5 cords. We found DNA in the form of blood and hair fibers on the electrical cord, and we were able to say that that was the murder weapon. We pulled his car over and arrested him at that time, and then took him back to our station.
He didn't resist or anything, and that was it. It was pretty simple.
At the trial 1 year later, the prosecution lays out a picture of what happened on the day Antoinette was killed.
Bye, Mom. Bye, baby. You look so pretty today.
You know, she's like, oh, you look pretty today. I hope you have a good day. And I love you. I just nodded and, left for work.
Did you get a chance to think about what we were talking about?
I did.
And?
He couldn't deal with the finality of the marriage. And there may have been some discussion that morning about how this would proceed, and I think something occurred where he walked up behind her.
And I just wanted to tell you, you're very beautiful.
What?
She had scratch marks because apparently when he was choking her, she was trying to grab the extension cord from around her neck. So she scratched herself.
The coroner estimates it took 2 agonizing minutes from start to finish.
The fact that he had to hold this extension cord around her neck as long as he did, and it just really angered me so much because she didn't deserve that.
After Antoinette has taken her last breath, Spencer tries to cover his tracks.
He was setting the stage to say that an intruder had come in the house based on the garage door being open and someone could just have walked in.
He then went and ran some errands to kind of create his alibi.
But he's not thinking straight. The receipts that are supposed to save him help to indict him.
And he laid them on the counter, but in order to do that, he had to step over her body to get to the kitchen.
That's not something a grieving or emotional upset husband would do, finding his wife dying on the floor.
And he laid them on the counter in the order in which he visited the establishment. Who does that?
And he makes another crucial mistake.
If Spencer would have turned Antoinette's phone off, we probably never would have found it, just based on the fact that we wouldn't have been able to receive signals from it.
Spencer seemed to be somebody who was sort of narcissistically self-indulgent, but we haven't really seen somebody who was a cold, calculated killer like we now know him to have been.
It is very clear to me that Spencer was making plans and an alibi before he killed Antoinette. This was a cold, calculated murder.
Spencer Chase is convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison.
I can't say enough about Detective Brown. Had it not been for him, this thing wouldn't have been solved.
But it can't bring back Antoinette.
I like to remember her smile and her personality, how she was always willing to help anybody with anything. That's the person that I knew.
But, you know, in life you love who you love, and it defies logic sometimes.
I don't know if I'll ever forgive him. I just don't understand why. I don't understand why he chose not to save her life after she saved his.
The Pacific Ocean is vast in a way that defies human comprehension. When you look at a map, American Samoa appears as a mere speck, a microscopic interruption in an endless expanse of blue. It is an unincorporated territory of the United States, deeply isolated, nestled deep in the South Pacific. It is a place of volcanic peaks, dense tropical foliage, and suffocating humidity. For tourists, this isolation is the very definition of a tropical paradise, a sanctuary far removed from the relentless pace of modern mainland life. The distance from the rest of the world offers a sense of peace, a disconnection from the noise of civilization. But isolation is a double-edged sword. Geography, in its sheer indifference, can provide a beautiful retreat, but it can also construct an impenetrable prison. When a place is this disconnected from the mainland, from the watchful eyes of federal oversight and the standard mechanisms of justice, the natural physical boundaries of the ocean begin to function like the walls of a fortress. The very water that makes the island beautiful also ensures that whatever happens on its shores remains entirely contained. The silence of the Pacific is absolute, and it is within this profound geographical silence that the darkest aspects of human exploitation can take root and flourish without interruption. The year was 1998. The global economy was accelerating, and the demand for manufactured goods, particularly garments, was insatiable. In the highly competitive world of apparel manufacturing, profit margins are brutally thin, and companies are perpetually searching for ways to reduce production costs. One of the most sought-after assets in this industry is the label that reads "Made in the USA." That simple string of words carries immense weight. It implies quality, ethical labor standards, and a certain prestige that consumers are willing to pay a premium for. However, manufacturing on the United States mainland is expensive, largely due to strict federal labor laws and mandatory minimum wage requirements designed to protect workers from exploitation. This dynamic creates a powerful incentive for businessmen to seek out loopholes. geographical and legal blind spots where the prestige of the label can be acquired without the financial burden of the regulations. American Samoa presented precisely this kind of anomaly. Due to its unique political status as an unincorporated territory, goods manufactured there could legally bear the coveted Made in the USA label. Crucially, however, the territory was exempt from the standard federal minimum wage laws that govern the mainland. The minimum wage on the island was drastically lower, a relic of localized economic policies. This intersection of American branding and substandard labor regulations created a perfect, legally permissible vacuum. It was an environment practically engineered for exploitation, waiting only for an architect willing to capitalize on human vulnerability. Kil Lee was a businessman of Korean descent who understood the mechanics of this loophole with chilling clarity. He did not look at American Samoa and see a vibrant culture or a tropical landscape. He looked at the island and saw an unparalleled opportunity for absolute control and maximized profit. Lee possessed a specific kind of narcissistic vision, a compulsion not just to run a business, but to rule a domain. The geographical isolation of Pago Pago appealed to him not for its beauty, but for its lack of scrutiny. In 1998, he established the Dewusa Garment Factory in a small village on the island. The name itself suggested a sprawling industrial enterprise, but the reality was far more insidious. Lee was not merely building a manufacturing plant, he was constructing a fiefdom. The physical structure of Dewusa was designed from the outset not to facilitate work, but to ensure containment. As the facility took shape, it began to resemble a compound rather than a workplace. The architectural choices reflected an underlying philosophy of paranoia and dominance. This was a man who intended to operate completely outside the boundaries of ethical business practices, and he required an environment that would physically enforce his will. He viewed himself not as an employer, but as a sovereign entity on this isolated patch of land, entirely untouchable by the laws and moral codes that govern the rest of the world. The factory was to be his kingdom, a place where his authority was absolute and unquestioned. To operate this massive facility, Lee required a large and compliant workforce. He needed individuals who would not only accept the grueling conditions of a garment factory, but who were also fundamentally disempowered and incapable of demanding basic rights. He set his sights on Southeast Asia, specifically targeting Vietnam. At the time, Vietnam was a nation undergoing significant economic transition, and for many citizens, particularly those in rural or economically disadvantaged areas, the promise of working abroad represented a singular, transformative opportunity. The concept of the American dream holds a potent, almost mythological sway in many parts of the world. It is the belief that hard work in an American territory will inevitably lead to financial salvation, a chance to elevate not just oneself, but entire extended families out of poverty. Lee and his network of recruiters weaponized this hope. They presented the Dewusa factory not as the grueling labor camp it was designed to be, but as a golden ticket, a legitimate pathway to prosperity under the protective banner of the United States. They preyed upon the aspirations of hundreds of women individuals who were willing to endure significant hardship if it meant securing a better future. Approximately 250 workers were recruited to travel across the Pacific to Pago Pago. The vast majority of these recruits were young Vietnamese women, demographic targets chosen specifically for their perceived vulnerability and cultural inclination toward diligence and obedience. The mechanism of their entrapment began long before they ever set foot on the island of American Samoa. It began with the financial architecture of their recruitment. In order to secure a position at the Dewusa factory, each worker was required to pay an exorbitant broker fee. These fees were staggering, ranging from $5,000 to $8,000 United States dollars. To understand the profound cruelty of this requirement, one must contextualize the value of that sum. For a laborer in Vietnam in the late 1990s, $8,000 was an astronomical figure, representing years, perhaps decades, of standard wages. It was not a sum of money that these women possessed in savings. To pay this fee, they were forced into crippling debt. They had to borrow from banks, from loan sharks, and from extended family members, pledging their family homes and their future earnings as collateral. This financial transaction was the true trap. The debt fundamentally altered the nature of their journey. They were not traveling to American Samoa as free laborers seeking employment. They were traveling as indentured servants. The debt functioned as an invisible chain, a psychological tether that bound them to kill Suli and the Dewusa factory before they even boarded their flights. They were entirely stripped of their autonomy. The crushing weight of the money owed meant that failure was not an option. Returning home without having earned enough to repay the loans would spell absolute financial ruin for their entire families. They were trapped by their own aspirations and the systemic greed of the recruitment process. As these women boarded planes and began the long journey across the vast expanse of the Pacific, they were propelled by a mixture of deep anxiety and desperate hope. They were leaving behind everything familiar, heading toward an island they had likely never heard of, entirely dependent on the promises of the men who had orchestrated their debt. The physical distance they traveled was immense, reinforcing the absolute finality of their decision. When they finally landed in American Samoa, stepping out into the oppressive, humid air of the South Pacific, the reality of their isolation must have been overwhelming. The volcanic mountains looming over Pago Pago Harbor are beautiful, but they are also imposing, a physical barrier that visually underscores the fact that there is nowhere to run. They had arrived at the edge of the world, carrying the crushing burden of their massive debts, believing they were stepping into a facility that would allow them to work their way toward freedom and prosperity. They believed they were entering a standard American workplace. They were entirely unaware that the man waiting for them viewed them not as employees, but as property. They were unaware that the factory they were about to enter had been designed to strip them of their humanity, to extract their labor through terror, and to ensure they could never escape the financial obligations that had brought them there. They had crossed an ocean to chase the American dream, only to walk directly into a meticulously engineered nightmare. Trapped within the walls of a fortress built on a legal loophole and a foundation of absolute cruelty. The transition from the oppressive humidity of the tarmac to the brutal reality of the Dewusa compound was swift and meticulously calculated. As the Vietnamese women disembarked from their flights, exhausted from the trans-Pacific journey and carrying the immense psychological weight of their crushing financial debts, they were immediately met by representatives of Kill Sili. There was no orientation, no period of acclimation, and no welcome to the United States territory. Instead, the very first administrative action taken by the management was the systematic confiscation of their passports. This was not framed as a routine security measure for safekeeping, though it might have been presented as such in the brief, disorienting moments of their arrival on the island. In reality, it was the foundational act of their imprisonment and the beginning of their erasure. A passport is fundamentally more than a travel document. It is the physical manifestation of a person's citizenship, their legal identity, and their inalienable right to free movement. By taking possession of these critical documents, the management of Dewusa effectively erased the legal existence of these women on the island of American Samoa. Without their passports, they were undocumented aliens stranded on an isolated territory thousands of miles from their homeland, entirely dependent on the very people who had just stripped them of their autonomy. The psychological impact of this specific moment was profound and immediate. It signaled a severe shift in the power dynamic, confirming that the promises of a legitimate, safe American workplace were a carefully constructed facade. They were no longer free laborers seeking a better life. They were captives bound to a system they could not escape. The physical structure of the Dewusa facility reinforced this terrifying new reality with stark architectural clarity. As the workers were transported to the site in the village of Pago Pago, the visual cues of their confinement became undeniable and deeply intimidating. The factory was not integrated into the local community but was highly isolated and aggressively fortified. Imposing high fences surrounded the entire perimeter of the property, topped with thick coils of razor wire that glinted menacingly in the relentless tropical sun. This architectural choice served a highly specific dual purpose. It kept unauthorized individuals and prying eyes out, but far more importantly, it kept the captive workforce securely locked inside. The heavy gates were heavily monitored, and a dedicated, intimidating security force patrolled the compound 24 hours a day, 7 days a week without interruption. These guards were not hired to protect the workers from external threats. They functioned explicitly as wardens in a privately operated, deeply illegal penal colony. The interior of the factory was a sprawling, claustrophobic cavern of heavy industrial machinery. Hundreds of sewing machines created a relentless, mechanical roar that made normal communication practically impossible and amplified the profound sense of disorientation among the women. The oppressive tropical heat, exacerbated by the complete lack of proper ventilation and the sheer density of human bodies packed tightly onto the production floor, created a physically suffocating atmosphere. The heavy air was thick with airborne fabric dust, machine oil, and the sweat of hundreds of terrified, exhausted women. The living quarters provided to them within the confines of the compound were equally dismal, characterized by severe overcrowding and deliberately unsanitary conditions. There was absolutely no privacy, no adequate space for rest, and absolutely no reprieve from the omnipresent, threatening gaze of the factory management and their aggressive security personnel. The women lived, slept, and worked within the exact same confined, heavily guarded footprint. A reality that transformed the industrial compound into a hermetically sealed ecosystem of absolute human exploitation. Within this heavily fortified environment, Kilsuli implemented a draconian regime designed to extract maximum physical labor while simultaneously minimizing his overhead costs to a degree that bordered on systemic, calculated starvation. The daily diet provided to the captive workers was deliberately and maliciously inadequate. Despite engaging in grueling, repetitive physical labor for staggering hours each day, the women were subjected to a feeding schedule that barely sustained their basic biological functions. The daily meals consisted almost entirely of small portions of plain white rice accompanied by flavorless boiled cabbage or a thin, nutrient-deficient liquid masquerading as soup. Essential proteins and vital nutrients were virtually non-existent in their daily intake. This severe dietary restriction was not a consequence of logistical difficulties in procuring food on an isolated island. Rather, it was a deeply calculated, cruel economic strategy. By drastically reducing the financial cost of feeding his massive workforce, Lee intentionally widened his profit margins, quite literally siphoning his personal wealth from the caloric intake and physical health of his captives. The physical toll of this engineered starvation diet, combined with the relentless, punishing demands of the factory production line, was devastating, visible, and immediate. Women who had arrived in American Samoa healthy and robust began to experience severe, rapid, and frightening weight loss. Malnutrition became a rampant epidemic within the locked compound. The physical deterioration was impossible to hide. Hair fell out in clumps, teeth loosened, and the workers suffered from chronic, debilitating fatigue and frequent dizzy spells. Yet they were violently forced to remain seated at their sewing machines. The cognitive dissonance of their daily situation was a quiet, profound horror. Their emaciated, trembling hands were rapidly assembling high-quality, pristine garments destined for brightly lit retail floors across the affluent United States mainland. These were garments that would soon be purchased by ordinary consumers entirely oblivious to the profound human suffering woven intricately into every single seam. The workers were slowly wasting away, their physical bodies deteriorating under the immense strain of producing clothes that they could never dream of affording. -1 while trapped in a ruthless financial system that viewed them purely as depreciating, disposable industrial assets rather than human beings. The severe physical weakening of the workforce through starvation was intentionally compounded by an atmosphere of constant, suffocating psychological terror engineered by the management. The operational core of the Dewusa factory was a punishing system of impossible production quotas. The daily manufacturing targets set by management were deliberately unattainable under any normal working conditions. They were mathematically designed to guarantee failure, thereby providing the management with a perpetual, fabricated justification for extreme discipline. When the exhausted workers inevitably fell short of these astronomical targets, or when severe physical fatigue caused them to make minor, inevitable errors in their complex sewing tasks, the response from the factory enforcement team was immediate, disproportionate, and violently physical. The security guards, acting on the explicit directives of Kill Soli, routinely utilized severe physical abuse to enforce absolute compliance and maximize productivity. The factory floor quickly morphed into a terrifying landscape of unpredictable, normalized violence. The guards brazenly wielded heavy metal pipes and high-voltage electronic stun guns, weapons typically associated with violent riot control rather than garment factory management. These brutal tools of pain were used not just to punish individual infractions, but to establish and maintain a pervasive, paralyzing culture of fear throughout the entire facility. The horrifying sight of a colleague being viciously beaten with a steel pipe or writhing from an electrical shock served as a gruesome, highly effective deterrent to the rest of the captive workforce. Any natural human impulse to complain about the rotting food, to request desperately needed medical attention, or to protest the endless, agonizing working hours was violently and immediately suppressed. The extreme geographical isolation of the island meant that the agonizing cries of the beaten workers were entirely swallowed by the deafening noise of the industrial machines and the dense, tropical foliage surrounding the high fences. They had absolutely no access to external communication, no ability to contact their desperate families back in Vietnam, and no feasible means of reaching out to local law enforcement. Local authorities were either completely unaware of the staggering extent of the horrors occurring behind the fences, or they were deliberately looking the other way to protect a major local employer. The women were entirely subjugated, hopelessly trapped in an endless cycle of deliberate starvation, profound physical exhaustion, and the constant, looming threat of severe bodily harm. This escalating environment of unchecked cruelty and systemic abuse eventually culminated in an event of such profound and visceral horror that it marked a dark, irreversible turning point in the silent suffering of the Daewoosa compound. It occurred in November of the year 2000. Tensions within the sweltering factory had been steadily rising to a breaking point, heavily fueled by long months of relentless starvation, escalating physical abuse, and the agonizing, crushing realization among the workers that their massive financial debts were actually growing larger. Management was continually and illegally deducting arbitrary, fabricated fees from their already meager, frequently withheld wages. During a particularly tense dispute on the crowded factory floor, a violent confrontation suddenly erupted. The exact genesis of the altercation was deeply rooted in the fundamentally oppressive conditions, a desperate, fleeting moment where the frantic pushback against the impossible labor demands collided violently with the ruthless, unforgiving enforcement mechanisms of Kill Soli's guards. A female Vietnamese worker, whose personal identity, dignity, and future had already been systematically stolen by the predatory recruitment process, faced the unrestrained wrath of the factory's security personnel. In a horrifying display of staggering brutality explicitly meant to permanently crush any lingering spirit of resistance among the hundreds of watching women, a guard viciously attacked her with a heavy metal pipe. The devastating blow was not aimed at a limb to merely inflict painful injury. It was a catastrophic, targeted strike directed squarely at her face. The raw force of the blunt impact was devastating, driving the heavy metal directly into her left eye with sickening force. The immediate aftermath on the factory floor was a scene of chaotic, bloody trauma and absolute, paralyzing terror. The brutalization of this young woman, the permanent, physical destruction of her sight, served as a chilling, undeniable declaration of absolute power by the factory management. It brutally demonstrated to every woman in the room that there were absolutely no limits to the violence the guards were willing to employ, and that the lives and physical bodies of the workers were considered entirely disposable in the pursuit of profit. The worker lost her eye permanently, plunging half of her visual world into eternal darkness. It was a horrific, permanent physical manifestation of the dark, inescapable reality they were all violently trapped within. The blinding of this worker was not a tragic accident or a mere loss of temper. It was the logical, terrifying, and inevitable endpoint of a system built entirely on absolute human exploitation. A brutal system that had successfully operated in the deep shadows of the Pacific Ocean, utterly far removed from the light of justice or the protection of the law. The blinding of the worker was not merely an act of unspeakable physical violence. It was a psychological earthquake that completely fractured the fragile foundation of control within the DeWusa compound. Up until that horrific moment in November, many of the captive women had clung to a desperate, necessary illusion. They believed, as victims of extreme abuse often must to maintain their sanity, that strict obedience might somehow guarantee their basic physical survival. They had rationalized the severe starvation and the arbitrary beatings as extreme punishments for perceived failures on the production line, clinging to the agonizing hope that if they just worked harder, sewed faster, and remained completely invisible, they could eventually endure the nightmare, pay off their staggering debts, and return to their families in Vietnam. The heavy metal pipe that permanently destroyed their fellow workers shattered that coping mechanism entirely. It demonstrated with terrifying, bloody clarity that compliance offered absolutely no protection. Violence at the DeWusa factory was not a disciplinary tool. It was the fundamental operational baseline, completely untethered from the workers' actual performance or behavior. The sight of the brutalized woman on the factory floor served as a grim, undeniable mandate to the rest of the captives. It proved that if they remained entirely passive, they would not simply be exploited for their labor. They would be systematically destroyed, physically and mentally, until nothing was left of them. The oppressive atmosphere inside the suffocating, overcrowded dormitories shifted irrevocably from paralyzed terror to a desperate, panicked realization that survival now required risking everything. The high fences topped with glinting razor wire no longer looked like an insurmountable barrier meant to keep them trapped inside. They looked like the perimeter of a heavily guarded slaughterhouse that they had to breach at all costs, regardless of the potentially lethal consequences of failure. The decision to attempt a physical escape from the fortified compound was born out of pure, unadulterated desperation rather than careful tactical planning. It was a deeply dangerous gamble taken by a few individuals whose profound fear of remaining in the factory had finally eclipsed their terror of the vicious security guards. Planning any form of resistance or escape inside the heavily monitored panopticon of DeWusa was incredibly difficult. The workers were kept in a state of constant, debilitating physical exhaustion, and the dense overcrowding in the unsanitary living quarters meant that privacy was a non-existent luxury. Whispered conversations about escape had to be conducted in the absolute dead of night, in the brief, agonizing intervals between the exhaustive, endless work shifts and the erratic, aggressive patrols of the security personnel. The desperate women had to carefully study the movements of the guards, noting any slight variations in their routines, any momentary lapses in their aggressive surveillance, and any blind spots in the factory's lighting. When the moment finally came, under the cover of the dense, oppressive tropical darkness that blankets American Samoa at night, a small group of women made their frantic move. They had to navigate the claustrophobic space of the compound without alerting the sleeping masses or drawing the attention of the vigilant enforcers. Reaching the perimeter fence was only the first terrifying physical hurdle. The fence was high, imposing, and specifically designed by Kill Suli to inflict injury upon anyone attempting to cross it. Scaling it required an immense physical effort from women whose bodies were already severely weakened by long months of systematic malnutrition and muscular atrophy. They had to pull their emaciated frames up the rattling chain link, their bare hands gripping the cold metal, acutely aware that the slightest metallic noise could instantly summon the guards and their heavy iron pipes. They had to navigate the vicious, tangled coils of razor wire at the top, suffering deep, painful lacerations in the dark, their blood mixing with the heavy tropical sweat. Dropping down onto the damp, unfamiliar soil on the outside of the perimeter was a moment of profound physical shock. For the first time in months, there was no armed guard immediately behind them, but the freedom they had just claimed was terrifyingly vast, deeply disorienting, and entirely unknown. Once outside the immediate perimeter of the heavily guarded factory, the escaped women found themselves plunged into a completely alien and intimidating landscape. They were running blindly through the village of Pago Pago, a place they had only ever viewed fleetingly from the windows of transport vehicles upon their initial, doomed arrival on the island. The dense volcanic terrain, the unfamiliar tropical vegetation, and the confusing layout of the local settlements offered a labyrinth of dark shadows for hiding, but also induced a profound sense of geographical disorientation. Driven by primal fear and the desperate, urgent need for immediate sanctuary from the pursuing guards, they instinctively sought out the most universal symbols of safety and refuge they could identify. They navigated toward the local churches. In almost every culture, a religious sanctuary is universally recognized as a safe haven for the persecuted and the vulnerable. They threw themselves upon the mercy of the local clergy and parishioners, arriving in a state of absolute distress, their physical bodies battered, bleeding from the razor wire, and showing the severe, undeniable signs of prolonged starvation. However, their desperate bid for rescue immediately collided with an impenetrable, devastating wall of cultural and linguistic isolation. The women spoke only Vietnamese. The local population spoke Samoan and English. The communication breakdown was absolute, instantaneous, and catastrophic for their chances of immediate rescue. The escapees tried frantically to pantomime their horrific experiences, pointing to their fresh, bleeding wounds, imitating the violent, downward swings of the heavy metal pipes, and desperately trying to convey the massive scale of the captive workforce still trapped behind the factory fences. But physical charades, no matter how frantic, cannot adequately communicate the complex, hidden legal reality of international human trafficking, systemic debt bondage, and mass organized starvation. Even more tragic than the immense language barrier was the chilling, deeply frustrating response of the local territorial authorities. When the presence of these frantic, injured foreign women eventually drew the attention of the local police force, the expected mechanism of legal justice completely failed to engage. The local government infrastructure in American Samoa at the time was relatively small, insular, and heavily reliant on the economic activity generated by large commercial businesses. Kilsuli was a prominent, highly visible figure, a major factory owner who provided significant local employment and vital revenue to the geographically isolated territory. The local law enforcement authorities demonstrated a profound, systemic reluctance to investigate the powerful businessmen based solely on the frantic, incomprehensible gestures of undocumented foreign laborers. The women's desperate, tearful pleas for protection were met with bureaucratic apathy, deep skepticism, and a horrifying tendency by the authorities to simply return the runaway workers directly to their employer, effectively handing the traumatized victims straight back to the very tormentors they had risked their lives to escape. While the physical escapes yielded only immense frustration and devastating, violent returns for many of the brave women who attempted them. The vast majority of the workers who remained trapped inside the suffocating walls of the Dewusa factory realized that a physical breakout was practically impossible and repeatedly futile. They understood that running into the jungle would only lead them back to the factory floor. They desperately needed an entirely different method to pierce the absolute, suffocating silence of their oceanic isolation. They needed to find a way to bypass the compromised local authorities and reach the outside world directly, specifically the mainland United States, where the rule of law might actually apply. Driven by a desperate, highly creative instinct for collective survival, they devised a covert strategy that was incredibly perilous but represented their absolute only viable lifeline to freedom. They decided to weaponize the very commercial products of their own brutal enslavement. The massive factory was constantly churning out thousands upon thousands of meticulously stitched garments, destined exclusively for the massive, anonymous retail markets and clothing racks of the United States mainland. The women began to secretly draft desperate letters of plea, turning their workspace into a hub of covert resistance. Finding the basic materials to write these notes was a massive daily risk. Possessing a scrap of unauthorized paper or a stolen pen could easily result in a severe, crippling beating from the guards. They wrote these notes during their microscopic, fiercely guarded moments of unobserved time, their hands trembling with the sheer terror of discovery. Because of the insurmountable language barrier, they had to be incredibly resourceful with their messaging. Those very few who possessed even a rudimentary grasp of the English language attempted to cobble together basic, desperate phrases. They wrote individual words expressing their immediate need for rescue, identifying themselves as captives, and detailing their extreme hunger. Other women wrote longer, heartbreakingly detailed accounts of the daily violence, the systematic starvation, and the gruesome blinding of their colleague. Writing entirely in their native Vietnamese, they wrote these detailed accounts praying blindly that whoever eventually found the fragile note on the mainland would possess the moral compass and the necessary resources to find a translator and understand the gravity of the situation. The physical act of hiding these letters was a masterclass in terrified, high-stakes stealth. As the finished, pressed garments moved down the final, rapid assembly line, constantly under the watchful, aggressive eyes of the security personnel, the exhausted workers would perform a delicate sleight of hand born of absolute, terrifying necessity. In a fraction of a second, a tiny, tightly folded piece of paper carrying the immense, crushing weight of hundreds of desperate lives would be slipped silently and invisibly into the deep pocket of a pair of trousers or securely tucked into the inner lining of a jacket. This highly dangerous, covert operation transformed the relentless, agonizing rhythm of the factory production floor into a continuous, unimaginably high-stakes gamble for survival. Every single garment that passed through their injured, exhausted hands became a potential, fragile vessel for their eventual salvation. The psychological weight of this daily act of defiance was immense and utterly exhausting. When a massive, metal shipping container was finally fully loaded with the finished clothing and heavily sealed by management, the captive women watched it leave the heavily guarded compound with a deeply complex, agonizing mixture of profound hope and crushing despair. They were essentially throwing thousands of fragile, paper messages into the vast, indifferent ocean of the global corporate supply chain, completely blind to their ultimate destination. They had absolutely no way of knowing if the garments would be shipped to a bustling, socially conscious metropolis where a consumer might read the note and alert the authorities, or to a remote rural outpost where the desperate plea would simply be discarded in the wash as meaningless trash. They did not know if the fragile paper letters would even survive the long oceanic transit, or if a meticulous factory quality control inspector would discover the hidden notes before the massive shipment even left the island harbor. Discovery of the organized letter-writing campaign would undoubtedly trigger a massive, violently retributive crackdown from Kilsuli and his ruthless security forces, potentially resulting in mass casualties among the workers. Days bled agonizingly into long weeks, and the horrific, predictable daily routine of severe starvation, completely impossible production quotas, and arbitrary, brutal beatings continued entirely unabated inside the walls. The factory remained, to all outside observation, an impenetrable, highly profitable fortress of human suffering. Yet, hidden deep within the pockets of the pristine clothes worn by entirely oblivious consumers walking the safe, paved streets of major American cities, the silent, desperate screams of the Dewusa workers were finally circulating freely in the open world. It was a staggering, deeply disturbing juxtaposition. The clean, newly purchased garments representing the casual, everyday comfort of the American consumer quietly harboring the desperate. Undeniable physical evidence of brutal modern-day slavery occurring on United States territory. The sheer accumulating volume of the hidden letters, combined with the persistent, albeit continually thwarted, physical escape attempts by the most desperate workers, eventually generated far too much friction for the dark system to maintain its absolute, required secrecy. The seemingly impregnable wall of silence carefully constructed by Kilsuli and passively maintained by local governmental indifference finally began to show microscopic but critical cracks. The monumental turning point did not arrive in a single, dramatic Hollywood moment, but rather through a slow, agonizing, but relentless accumulation of undeniable evidence that eventually reached the right people. A worker who had miraculously managed to physically escape the compound and evade capture by the local police long enough finally managed to make direct contact with a sympathetic, independent individual operating outside the immediate sphere of local political and economic influence. Simultaneously, disturbing rumors of the desperate notes being found by confused consumers in retail clothing on the mainland began to circulate, slowly catching the attention of dedicated labor rights advocates and human trafficking watchdogs. The crucial, paradigm-shifting breakthrough occurred when a specific non-governmental organization, operating entirely independently of the compromised local political structure of American Samoa, recognized a terrifying, consistent pattern emerging from the isolated Pacific territory. This particular organization possessed the necessary financial resources, the vital Vietnamese language capabilities, and the crucial, deep understanding of federal anti-trafficking statutes necessary to bypass the local territorial authorities entirely. They began to quietly, methodically gather the fragmented, terrifying accounts, carefully translating the desperate Vietnamese pleas found in the pockets and compiling a massive, horrifying legal dossier detailing systemic physical abuse, elaborate debt bondage, and extreme, organized violence. They fully realized that the escalating situation at the Dewusa facility was not a mere, localized labor dispute or an issue of slightly poor working conditions. It was a massive, highly organized transnational criminal enterprise operating a brutal forced labor camp under the protective umbrella of the American flag. This critical realization was the vital catalyst required to escalate the crisis far beyond the isolated shores of the Pacific Ocean. The non-governmental organization took this meticulously compiled mountain of evidence directly to the highest, most powerful levels of federal law enforcement on the mainland United States. They forcefully presented a comprehensive legal case that could no longer be ignored, brushed aside by local corruption, or hidden securely behind the protective veneer of the territory's vital economic interests. The desperate, whispered pleas in the dark dormitories and the fragile, hidden paper notes had finally crossed the vast ocean, successfully reaching the highest authorities of the United States Department of Justice, setting the immediate stage for a massive, unprecedented tactical response. When the comprehensive dossier compiled by the non-governmental organization finally landed on the desks of the United States Department of Justice in Washington, the initial reaction was a profound, collective disbelief that quickly morphed into intense administrative urgency. The federal prosecutors and investigators reviewing the translated letters and smuggled photographs were looking at a situation that fundamentally contradicted every assumption about modern American labor standards. This was not a nuanced case of wage theft or minor regulatory infractions. The evidence pointed to a massive, systemic operation of human chattel occurring on sovereign United States soil. The geographical reality of American Samoa, previously viewed merely as a distant, strategically insignificant dot in the Pacific Ocean, suddenly became the epicenter of a massive federal crisis. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was immediately tasked with verifying the astonishing claims and dismantling the criminal enterprise. But they faced a logistical and jurisdictional nightmare of unprecedented proportions. American Samoa is isolated, possessing its own localized governmental structures, customs agencies, and deeply entrenched social hierarchies. The federal agents could not simply fly onto the island and begin kicking down doors without triggering massive political blowback and potentially causing the factory owner to panic, which could result in the immediate destruction of crucial evidence or the severe physical harm of the captive workforce. Therefore, the initial phase of the federal investigation had to be conducted with an absolute, surgical level of extreme secrecy. A small, highly specialized vanguard team of federal agents was quietly dispatched across the Pacific Ocean, traveling entirely under the radar to infiltrate the island without alerting the local power structures. Their primary objective was to independently corroborate the horrifying contents of the non-governmental organization dossier and establish a legally airtight foundation for a massive federal raid, all while operating entirely in the shadows of a community where everyone knew everyone else. They had to navigate a delicate web of local politics where the factory was viewed as a crucial economic pillar. The agents knew that overt inquiries made to local law enforcement would inevitably leak back to the compound. Instead, they relied on covert surveillance techniques and clandestine meetings, setting up hidden observation posts on the volcanic ridges overlooking the factory perimeter. Through powerful telephoto lenses, they documented the grim reality that matched the smuggled letters perfectly. Observing the imposing razor wire fences and the visibly emaciated condition of the heavily guarded workers. More crucially, the agents managed to establish fragile, highly dangerous lines of communication with the few workers who had previously managed to escape the compound and were currently hiding in the deepest shadows of the local religious sanctuaries. These clandestine interviews were harrowing and legally significant. Through trusted, federally vetted interpreters, the agents sat in dimly lit rooms and listened to first-hand accounts of unimaginable cruelty. They documented the crushing debt bondage, the deliberate, systematic starvation diets of plain rice and cabbage, and the pervasive culture of violent physical terror enforced by the security personnel. The most vital piece of evidence gathered during this covert phase was the detailed, horrifying account of the young woman whose eye had been permanently destroyed by a metal pipe. This specific, visceral act of violence provided the undeniable, concrete proof of egregious physical harm required to escalate the federal response from a standard labor investigation into a full-scale, heavily armed tactical rescue mission. With the horrifying reality of the factory fully verified and extensively documented, the investigation transitioned from covert intelligence gathering to the highly complex planning of a massive tactical operation. The Department of Justice understood that a standard warrant execution would be disastrous. They were dealing with a heavily fortified compound containing hundreds of deeply traumatized, starving captives and a hostile security force that had already demonstrated a chilling willingness to use extreme violence. The logistical challenges of the impending raid were staggering. If they successfully breached the compound, they would instantaneously become responsible for the physical safety, medical care, and housing of over 250 victims of severe human trafficking on an isolated island with extremely limited infrastructure. The operation required unprecedented coordination between multiple federal agencies, bringing together the Federal Bureau of Investigation, immigration authorities, and specialized victim assistance teams. They had to secretly charter specialized medical transport, arrange for massive quantities of emergency food and psychiatric support, and secure a temporary holding facility to house the victims once they were extracted from the factory. Every single detail had to be meticulously planned from thousands of miles away on the mainland, maintaining absolute operational security to prevent the perpetrators from realizing that the full weight of the United States government was about to descend upon their Pacific fortress. The tactical plan was designed around overwhelming speed, absolute surprise, and massive federal presence to ensure complete control. The goal was to breach the perimeter, secure the dangerous security personnel, and take complete control of the sprawling facility before anyone inside had the opportunity to react, destroy financial records, or harm the captives. The tension leading up to the execution date was suffocating as agents watched the factory from their hidden vantage points, knowing that every additional day required for planning meant another day of starvation, beatings, and unimaginable suffering for the women trapped behind the razor wire. The execution of the federal raid on the compound shattered the deceptive, tropical tranquility of American Samoa with the sudden, overwhelming force of a hurricane. It was a massive, highly coordinated strike involving dozens of heavily armed federal agents descending upon the facility simultaneously. They did not knock or request entry. They breached the heavy gates with tactical precision, swarming the perimeter and instantly neutralizing the brutal security guards who had terrorized the workforce for so long. The element of absolute surprise was highly successful. The factory management, entirely accustomed to operating with total impunity and complete local complicity, was caught completely off guard by the sudden, terrifying arrival of federal law enforcement. Agents rapidly secured the roaring factory floor, forcefully shutting down the massive, deafening sewing machines, and plunging the cavernous space into a shocking, profound silence. As the tactical teams moved deep into the dark, suffocating dormitories, the true, horrifying scale of the human tragedy was finally laid bare before their eyes. The agents, many of whom were seasoned veterans of severe criminal investigations, were profoundly shaken by what they discovered in the living quarters. They found hundreds of women packed into unsanitary, cramped spaces, their bodies visibly ravaged by months of severe, calculated starvation. The air was thick with the smell of sickness and absolute fear. The victims, initially terrified by the sudden influx of armed men, slowly began to realize that the uniforms they were seeing did not belong to the factory enforcers. When the agents finally located the young woman who had been viciously blinded, the horrific visual evidence of her destroyed eyes served as the ultimate, damning indictment of the entire enterprise. The physical rescue of the workers was only the beginning of a massive, complex humanitarian operation that would test the limits of the federal resources deployed to the small, isolated territory in the remote regions of the Pacific Ocean. Agents immediately began distributing emergency medical care, clean water, and the first adequate food the women had seen since their tragic arrival on the island. Specialized medical personnel evaluated the most critical cases of malnutrition and physical trauma, preparing them for immediate transport to secure medical facilities. Simultaneously, specialized evidence recovery teams systematically tore through the administrative offices, executing the search warrants with meticulous precision. They seized massive quantities of financial documents, hidden accounting ledgers, and the crucial, confiscated passports that proved the systematic nature of the debt bondage and human trafficking. The seizure of these administrative documents was a critical phase of the operation, as investigators methodically categorized the forged contracts, the illegal deduction logs, and the massive piles of stolen identification papers that represented the stolen lives of the workers. Every single piece of paper was meticulously bagged and tagged, building an insurmountable mountain of empirical evidence against the factory owner. The careful extraction of the surviving workers was handled with deep, profound empathy by the federal teams. Federal victim assistance coordinators worked tirelessly through interpreters to assure the terrified women that they were finally safe, that their horrific deaths were entirely nullified by federal law, and that their abusers would face severe legal consequences for their actions. The sudden transition from absolute captivity to sudden, overwhelming freedom was deeply traumatic and confusing for many of the victims, requiring immediate, specialized psychological intervention right there on the factory floor before they could be safely relocated. The dark, heavily fortified compound, which had operated for years as an impenetrable fortress of misery and exploitation, was finally completely dismantled by the full force of the federal government. The physical chains of debt and the high fences of razor wire were broken, ending a dark, violent chapter of abuse. However, as the traumatized survivors were gently escorted out of the gates and away from the terrifying industrial complex, the federal investigators knew that their mission was far from complete. The successful raid had ended the immediate physical danger, but the immense, arduous legal process of bringing the perpetrators to justice and securing permanent, meaningful restitution for the hundreds of victims was only just beginning to take shape, setting the stage for a monumental legal battle that would eventually unfold in a federal courtroom thousands of miles away on the mainland. The legal battlefield for the Dewisa case shifted from the isolated, humid shores of American Samoa to the structured, sterile environment of a federal courthouse in Honolulu, Hawaii. This geographical transition was not merely a matter of administrative convenience. It was a fundamental necessity for the integrity of the American judicial system. The Department of Justice recognized that holding a trial of this magnitude and sensitivity within the small, insular community of Pago Pago would be fraught with complications. In American Samoa, the social and economic influence of Kil Suli had been pervasive, and the local political infrastructure had already demonstrated a troubling tendency toward passivity or outright complicity. By moving the proceedings thousands of miles north to the island of Oahu, The federal government sought to ensure a jury pool and a legal environment free from the localized pressures and potential intimidation that had allowed the factory to operate as a fortress of abuse for so long. The shift to Honolulu symbolized the moment the case officially transcended the boundaries of a territorial labor dispute and entered the realm of a landmark federal prosecution. The courthouse in Hawaii became the stage for a reckoning that would eventually define the United States' modern approach to human trafficking and forced labor. The formal indictment against Kil Suli was a massive, meticulously constructed document that reflected the staggering scale of the crimes committed within the walls of the De Wusa compound. He faced a total of 14 federal counts, a comprehensive list that read like a manual on the systematic destruction of human dignity. The core of the prosecution's case rested on charges of human trafficking and involuntary servitude, legal terms that carried immense weight and required a high burden of proof. The government had to demonstrate not just that the working conditions were poor, but that Lee had intentionally used a combination of physical violence, psychological terror, and financial entrapment to force the workers to remain against their will. Beyond the trafficking charges, the indictment included counts of money laundering and bribery, revealing the corrupt financial architecture that had sustained the factory. Lee had not only exploited the workers, but had also attempted to subvert the local legal system to protect his interests. The 14 counts represented a total rejection of Lee's business model, framing his entire operation not as a legitimate enterprise, but as a sophisticated criminal syndicate built on the suffering of hundreds of Vietnamese and Chinese women. As the trial commenced, the physical presence of the survivors in the Honolulu courtroom provided a visceral and undeniable counterpoint to the clinical, legalistic arguments of the defense. Hundreds of hours had been spent by federal investigators and specialized translators to prepare the victims for the grueling process of testimony. For these women, many of whom were still grappling with the profound trauma of their captivity and the lingering effects of systemic starvation, the act of speaking in a federal court was a monumental feat of courage. They were required to revisit the darkest moments of their lives, recounting in excruciating detail the daily reality of the rice and cabbage diets, the agonizing hours at the sewing machines, and the constant, looming threat of the metal pipes. The courtroom was equipped with sophisticated translation systems to bridge the immense linguistic gap, ensuring that every word of their testimony was accurately recorded. The atmosphere in the room was often suffocatingly tense as the women, through their interpreters, described the psychological trap of the broker fees and the terror of having their passports confiscated. Their voices, though often quiet and strained by emotion, filled the silence of the courtroom with a collective narrative of exploitation that no amount of legal maneuvering from the defense could successfully obscure. The most devastating and pivotal moment of the entire trial arrived when the young woman who had been blinded by a security guard's metal pipe took the stand. Her presence alone was a profound indictment of Kil Suli's regime. The physical evidence of her trauma was not a document or a photograph, but a permanent, irreversible injury that she carried with her into the witness box. As she described the events of that November night in 2000, the courtroom was gripped by a chilling silence. Through an interpreter, she recounted the moment of impact, the sudden eruption of pain, and the terrifying realization that her world had been permanently halved by darkness. She spoke of the absolute helplessness she felt as a captive in a foreign land, unable to seek medical care or justice while her employer looked on with indifference. This testimony provided the visceral, emotional core of the prosecution's case, transforming the abstract legal definitions of forced labor into a concrete, undeniable reality of human suffering. Her dignity and clarity in the face of such horrific trauma resonated deeply with the jury, making it impossible for the defense to frame the violence as an isolated incident or an unauthorized act by a rogue guard. Throughout the proceedings, Kil Suli's demeanor remained steady in arrogance and a total lack of remorse. Even as the mountain of evidence against him grew to insurmountable heights, he maintained the posture of a man who believed he was above the laws of the United States. He viewed the workers not as human beings with rights, but as disposable industrial components that he had purchased through a recruitment process he considered entirely legitimate. His defense team attempted to minimize the severity of the conditions, suggesting that the workers were exaggerating their suffering or that the violence was a necessary means of maintaining order in a difficult industrial environment. They tried to lean on the legal ambiguities of American Samoa's territorial status, arguing that the standards of the mainland should not be applied so rigidly to an island operation. However, these arguments rang hollow against the sheer volume of testimony and the physical evidence recovered during the federal raid. Lee's narcissistic belief in his own impunity, which had allowed him to rule the Dewusa compound as a personal fiefdom, proved to be his ultimate undoing in a court where the rule of law was enforced by the full weight of the federal government. The jury's deliberations were exhaustive, reflecting the complexity and the historical significance of the case. When the verdict was finally read in 2005, it represented a total victory for the prosecution and a profound moment of vindication for the hundreds of women who had suffered in silence. Kilsuli was found guilty on all 14 counts, including the most serious charges of human trafficking and involuntary servitude. The reading of the word guilty, repeated 14 times, echoed through the courtroom as a final, definitive closure to the dark era of the Dewusa factory. For the victims seated in the gallery, the verdict was an overwhelming emotional release. Many wept openly, not out of sorrow, but out of the sheer, staggering relief that their voices had finally been heard and believed by the highest authorities of the country they had once dreamed of joining. The legal system, which had seemed so distant and indifferent when they were trapped behind the razor wire in Tego Pago, had finally delivered a clear and uncompromising judgment against their oppressor. The sentencing phase of the trial provided the final, heavy punctuation to the legal proceedings. The presiding judge, in delivering the final sentence, offered a blistering critique of Lee's actions, characterizing the Dewusa operation as a stain on the American flag and a barbaric regression into a form of slavery that the country had long ago fought to abolish. Kilsuli was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison, a term that, given his age at the time, was effectively a life sentence. The severity of the punishment was intended to serve as a powerful deterrent to any other businessmen who might seek to exploit geographical loopholes to bypass fundamental human rights. The 40-year term reflected the extreme nature of the cruelty involved, specifically the calculated use of starvation and the horrific physical maiming of workers. As Lee was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the image of the once powerful factory owner being taken into permanent federal custody served as a potent symbol of the absolute collapse of his Pacific empire. However, the pursuit of justice encountered a significant and deeply frustrating hurdle when it came to the matter of financial restitution. The court recognized the immense economic damage inflicted upon the workers and ordered Kilsuli to pay over $1.8 million in restitution to the victims. This sum was intended to compensate the women for their stolen wages, the exorbitant broker fees they had been forced to pay, and the profound physical and psychological trauma they had endured. Yet, the actual collection of these funds proved to be an agonizingly difficult task for federal authorities. During the long period leading up to his arrest and trial, Lee had been meticulously active in tilling his financial tracts and tantan, or dispersing, his substantial assets. He had moved money through complex networks and hidden accounts, ensuring that by the time the court order was issued, his visible domestic assets were a mere fraction of the wealth he had extracted from the labor of the captive workers. This financial evasion was a final, parting act of cruelty from a man who had already stolen years of life from hundreds of people. For many of the Vietnamese women, the lack of immediate restitution meant that the crushing debts they had incurred to travel to American Samoa remained a looming, terrifying reality for their families back home. While they were physically free from the factory, the financial chains of the predatory recruitment process were not so easily broken. The federal government continued its efforts to trace and seize Lee's hidden assets, but the process was slow, bureaucratic, and often met with dead ends in foreign jurisdictions. The struggle to recover the $1.8 million underscored a grim reality of modern human trafficking. While the physical abusers can be imprisoned, the financial systems that profit from their crimes are often far more resilient and difficult to dismantle. The victims had won their freedom and their day in court, but the full restoration of their lives remained stalled by the cynical financial maneuvers of the man who had enslaved them. The trial had successfully delivered a sentence of time, but it struggled to deliver the sentence of true, transformative financial justice that the survivors so desperately needed to rebuild their shattered futures. The factory site in the village of Pago Pago stands today as a decaying skeleton of rusted iron and shattered glass, a silent monument to a dream that was systematically dismantled into a calculated nightmare. Nature, in its persistent and indifferent way, has begun to reclaim the land where so much human suffering once occurred behind high fences. The tropical vines of American Samoa, thick and relentless, now crawl over the perimeters that once held 250 women captive. The razor wire, once a glinting symbol of absolute terror and physical confinement, is now brittle with rust and half hidden by the vibrant green foliage of the South Pacific. It is difficult for a modern passerby to imagine that this quiet, crumbling site was once a high-pressure industrial prison, a place where the rhythmic, deafening clatter of hundreds of sewing machines was used to drown out the silent cries of the starving and the abused. The physical erasure of the Dewusa factory is nearly complete, but the psychological and legal scars it left behind are permanently etched into the history of the United States. The silence that now hangs over that specific patch of land is a heavy one, carrying the weight of a story that forced an entire nation to look into a mirror and confront the dark reality of modern-day slavery existing under its own flag. For the survivors, the conclusion of the trial in Honolulu was not an absolute ending, but the beginning of a profound and deeply complex new chapter of their lives. The federal government, finally recognizing the extraordinary nature of their ordeal and the vital role their brave testimony played in the conviction of Kilsuli, offered a unique and necessary form of legal protection. Most of the women were granted what is known as a T visa, a specific immigration status created for victims of severe forms of human trafficking. This allowed them to remain in the United States legally, providing a path to permanent residency and eventually citizenship. It was a bittersweet irony that the very country that had allowed them to be enslaved within a legal loophole now became their permanent sanctuary and their only hope for a future. Many of these women chose to leave the isolated Pacific behind entirely, migrating to the mainland United States to start over in cities with established Vietnamese communities. They moved to places like Seattle, Los Angeles, and Houston, trading the volcanic peaks of Samoa for the sprawling urban landscapes of the American West. They found work in service industries and other garment factories that, while still demanding, operated within the boundaries of the law and paid a fair wage. They began the slow, agonizing process of rebuilding their lives from nothing, sending money back to Vietnam not as captives of a debt bondage scheme, but as free women reclaiming their financial autonomy and their family's honor. However, the shadow of the unpaid $1.8 million in restitution remained a persistent and painful burden for many years. While the women were physically free and living on the American mainland, the financial consequences of their time at Dewusa continued to haunt their families back in Vietnam. The massive loans they had taken out to pay the original broker fees were still held by banks and aggressive local moneylenders in their home villages. Without the court-ordered restitution from Kilsuli, who had successfully hidden his assets before his conviction, many families faced the loss of their homes and ancestral land. The justice delivered in the courtroom was clear and principled, but the economic justice required to fully heal the damage was elusive and frustratingly slow. The survivors found themselves in a strange state of limbo, living in the land of the free while still psychologically tethered to the debts incurred during their period of enslavement. This lingering financial trauma serves as a stark reminder that the crime of human trafficking does not end when the gates are opened. Its echoes continue to vibrate through the bank accounts and the dinner tables of the victims' families for decades. The physical and psychological scars borne by the women are perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Dewusa tragedy. The young woman who was blinded in her left eye remains a living testament to the sheer brutality of Kilsuli's regime. Her life in America has been one of quiet resilience, but every time she looks in a mirror, she's reminded of the metal pipe and the factory floor in Pago Pago. For her and many others, the trauma of systemic starvation and constant fear has led to chronic health issues and persistent post-traumatic stress. The sound of a loud mechanical noise or the sight of a security uniform can still trigger a visceral reaction of terror. The community of survivors has remained loosely connected, a sorority of pain bound together by an experience that most people find impossible to comprehend. They are the survivors of a war that was fought not on a battlefield, but on a production line, and their victory is measured in the simple, quiet moments of a life lived without the threat of a metal pipe or the agony of a hollow stomach. From a legislative perspective, the Dewusa case acted as a massive, unavoidable catalyst for change in the United States. It was the primary driver behind the passage and subsequent strengthening of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. Before this case, the legal framework for addressing modern slavery was fragmented and often focused on the victim's immigration status rather than the crimes of the traffickers. Dewusa proved that slavery could exist in plain sight, sheltered by the very laws intended to promote American commerce. It forced Congress to close the geographical and regulatory loopholes that had allowed Kill Soli to operate with such impunity in American Samoa. Today, federal oversight of labor practices in the territories is significantly more robust, and the minimum wage laws have been harmonized to prevent the creation of the kind of economic vacuum that Lee so ruthlessly exploited. The case redefined human trafficking as a human rights crisis rather than just a labor dispute, setting a global standard for how developed nations should identify and prosecute the exploitation of vulnerable migrant populations. The story of Dewusa also leaves us with a deeply uncomfortable reflection on the nature of global consumerism and the hidden costs of the American lifestyle. For years, the garments produced by those starving women were sold in major retail stores across the country, worn by people who had no idea that the Made in the USA label on their clothing was a badge of profound suffering. We are forced to confront the reality that our demand for cheap, high-quality goods often creates the very market conditions that predatory businessmen like Kill Soli exploit. The Dewusa factory was not an anomaly. It was a logical, if extreme, extension of a global supply chain that prioritizes profit margins over human dignity. Every hidden letter found in a pocket and every desperate plea for help was a message to the consumer. A reminder that there is no such thing as a cheap product when the human cost is factored into the price. The case serves as a permanent warning that vigilance is the only defense against the return of such brutality, and that the integrity of a national label is only as strong as the protections afforded to the most vulnerable people who work under it. As we look back on the history of American Samoa and the dark chapter of the Dewusa factory, we are reminded of the incredible power of the human voice to pierce through the silence of isolation. The women who were trapped in that compound were not just victims. They were investigators, messengers, and ultimately the architects of their own liberation. Through their hidden letters and their frantic escapes, they reached across a vast ocean to demand that the promises of American justice be fulfilled. They refused to be erased by the geography of the Pacific or the grade of their captor. Their courage in standing up in a federal courtroom, facing the man who had tried to break their spirits, remains one of the most powerful examples of resilience in the history of the American legal system. They proved that no hun HEO is too remote and no fence is too high to keep out the light of the law, provided there are people willing to listen to the whispers of the exploited. The Pacific Ocean continues to wash against the shores of Pago Pago, its blue expanse as beautiful and indifferent as it was in 1998. The village of Leon is peaceful, and the sound of the sewing machines has long since faded into history. But for those who know the story, the ghost of the Dewusa factory still lingers in the humid air. It is a story of a dream that was stolen and a justice that was hard-won. It is a story that begins with a brochure promising a better life and ends with a federal prison sentence and a legacy of legal reform. Most importantly, it is the story of 250 women who, despite being stripped of their passports and their dignity, never lost their humanity. They are the true heart of this narrative. And their journey from the darkness of a locked compound to the freedom of the American mainland is a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. As we close this chapter on the Dewusa case, we are left with a final, sobering thought. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance. And the true measure of a society is not found in the labels it produces, but in the way it protects those who labor in the shadows of its prosperity. The silence of the Pacific is no longer absolute. It is filled with the echoes of those who spoke up, reminding us that even at the edge of the world, no one is ever truly alone if their story is heard. In the end, Kil Soleil's legacy is not the wealth he tried to accumulate or the factory he built, but the laws he inadvertently helped to create. He is currently serving his time in a federal facility, a man who once believed he was a king, now just another number in the system he tried to subvert. The women he once controlled are now citizens, mothers, and grandmothers, living their lives in the light of a freedom they fought for with every stitch they sewed. Their victory is complete, even if their restitution was not. They have reclaimed their names, their identities, and their futures. The Dewusa case remains a landmark, a chilling reminder of what happens when greed is left unchecked by conscience, and a stirring example of how the most marginalized voices can change the course of history. As the sun sets over the harbor of Pago Pago, casting long shadows over the ruins of the old garment factory, we remember those who suffered there and the long, difficult road they traveled to reach the shore of justice. The story of Dewusa is over, but its lessons are permanent, woven into the fabric of the nation and the hearts of everyone who believes that human dignity is a right that no distance or death can ever take away. The legacy of the Dewusa case does not merely exist in the archives of federal courthouses or within the brittle pages of old law journals. It lives and breathes in the very architecture of modern human rights enforcement. To look back at the events in American Samoa from the perspective of nearly 3 decades later is to witness a fundamental turning point in how the civilized world defines the boundaries of labor, dignity, and the responsibility of the state. Before Kil Soleil established his industrial fortress in Pago Pago, the concept of slavery was often viewed through a historical lens, a dark relic of a bygone era that had been officially abolished by the 13th Amendment. The horrors of Dewusa shattered this complacency, forcing a modern, globalized society to recognize that the chains of the 21st century are not always made of iron. They are made of debt, they are made of confiscated passports, and they are made of the desperate, whispered hope for a better life. The case served as a brutal, visceral awakening for the United States government, proving that the geographical isolation of its territories could create a vacuum where the most basic human rights were simply discarded in favor of industrial efficiency and corporate profit. This realization triggered a profound transformation in federal law, leading to the creation of legal mechanisms that would eventually be used to dismantle hundreds of other trafficking operations across the globe. The most significant legislative descendant of the Dewusa tragedy was the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of the year 2000, a piece of legislation that completely redefined the legal landscape of human exploitation. Prior to this, investigators often struggled to prosecute traffickers if there was no evidence of physical shackles or overt kidnapping. The Dewusa case provided the chilling, empirical evidence that psychological and financial coercion could be just as effective and just as deadly as physical force. The testimony of the Vietnamese women who described being trapped not just by fences, but by the crushing weight of their families' debts in Vietnam, provided the roadmap for a new kind of justice. The law began to recognize that a person is not free if they are forced to work under the threat of financial ruin for their loved ones. This shift in the burden of proof was revolutionary, allowing federal agents to look past the surface of a workplace and investigate the invisible tethers of debt and intimidation that keep modern slaves in their place. The T-Visa program, which grew out of this era of reform, became a lifeline for thousands of individuals, offering them a chance to reclaim their humanity in exchange for the courage to stand against their oppressors. The Dewusa survivors were the pioneers of this system, their trauma serving as the foundation for a protective shield that continues to guard the vulnerable today. Beyond the halls of Congress, the case sent a massive, irreversible shockwave through the global garment industry and the boardrooms of major American retailers. For the first time, the concept of supply chain transparency moved from the fringe of activist rhetoric to the center of corporate strategy. The realization that a Made in the USA label could be stained with the blood and sweat of forced labor was a public relations catastrophe that no marketing budget could easily erase. Retailers like JC, Penny, and others found themselves in a position of profound ethical liability, forced to answer for the conditions in a factory thousands of miles away that they had never visited. This led to the birth of corporate social responsibility as we know it today, with many companies implementing rigorous, independent auditing processes for their overseas and territorial contractors. While the system remains imperfect and exploitation still exists in the shadows of global trade, the DeWissa case established the principle that a brand is responsible for every stitch in its garments, regardless of how many miles or borders lie between the boardroom and the sewing machine. The consumer's relationship with the product changed as well, as a new generation of shoppers began to demand more than just a low price. They began to demand a conscience. In the small villages of Vietnam where the journey of the DeWissa workers first began, the legacy of the case is perhaps the most intimate and heartbreaking. For the families of the survivors, the story is not one of legal reform or corporate strategy, but of a long, agonizing wait for daughters and sisters who left with hope and returned as ghosts of their former selves. The social fabric of these communities was permanently altered by the mass migration and the subsequent trauma of the factory. For years, the stigma of being a failed migrant worker or a victim of trafficking hung over many of the women, a cruel secondary victimization that added to their psychological burden. Yet, as the years passed and the stories of their resilience in the American courtrooms filtered back home, that stigma transformed into a profound respect for their strength. The women who testified in Honolulu are viewed by many as heroines who stood up to a powerful predator and won their freedom. Their success in securing a future in the United States has allowed them to send resources back to their villages, building new homes and funding the education of a younger generation, effectively breaking the cycle of poverty that led them to the recruitment brokers in the first place. The physical toll of the factory continues to manifest in the aging bodies of the survivors now living across the United States. Many of these women suffer from chronic back pain, repetitive strain injuries, and respiratory issues linked to the years they spent hunched over sewing machines in poorly ventilated, dust-filled rooms. The psychological scars are equally persistent, with many survivors experiencing lifelong struggles with anxiety and a deep-seated mistrust of authority figures. The specific tragedy of the woman who was blinded remains the most visceral symbol of what was stolen. In her world, the Pacific sunset is a fragmented memory, a reminder of the night her sight was traded for a businessman's profit. The community of survivors, though scattered across various American cities, remains a vital support network, a hidden sisterhood that understands a specific type of pain that no one else can truly grasp. They are the living evidence of a dark chapter in American history. Their very existence a reminder that the price of the cheap goods we take for granted is often paid in the health and sanity of people who have no voice in the marketplace. The island of American Samoa itself has underwent a slow and complex process of healing and self-reflection in the decades following the raid. The DeWissa case was a stain on the reputation of the territory, a moment when the world saw not the beauty of Samoan culture, but the ugliness of an industrial labor camp operating with local complicity. In the years since, there has been a concerted effort to strengthen the local labor department and ensure that the island's unique legal status is never again used as a shield for exploitation. The community of Pago Pago has had to reckon with the fact that many people knew something was wrong but failed to act, a silence that allowed Kil Suli to thrive for as long as he did. The crumbling ruins of the factory serve as a permanent reminder to the local population that economic development must never come at the expense of human dignity. The island remains a place of immense natural beauty, but there is a sober awareness now that its isolation is a vulnerability that requires constant vigilance to protect both its people and its guests. The financial restitution that was promised but never fully delivered remains the great unfinished piece of justice in the DeWissa narrative. The $1.8 million that Kil Suli was ordered to pay represents the stolen time, the stolen health, and the stolen dreams of hundreds of women. The fact that he was able to hide his assets and evade his final responsibility is a testament to the sophisticated nature of modern financial crime. It highlights a critical flaw in our justice system. We are far better at punishing the physical act of abuse than we are at recovering the illicit profits that drive it. For many of the survivors, the lack of this money meant that the financial recovery of their families was delayed by a decade or more, forcing them to work twice as hard to overcome the debt they were originally sold into. The paper victory of the court order is a cold comfort when the actual funds remain hidden in shadow accounts or lost in the fog of international banking. It is a reminder that the battle against trafficking is not just a fight against violence, but a fight against the greed that makes that violence profitable. As we reach the final conclusion of this long and harrowing journey, we are left to meditate on the concept of the Pacific silence that allowed the Dewusa factory to exist in the first place. The ocean is vast, and its depths are hidden, but it is also a bridge that connects us, all in a globalized world. The letters that the women hid in the pockets of their garments were a bridge across that silence, a desperate reaching out from the darkness to the light. Their story is a reminder that there is no such thing as a remote location in the modern age. What happens on a tiny island in the South Pacific vibrates through the courtrooms of Hawaii and the halls of power in Washington. The Dewusa case proved that when we look at a product, we are looking at a story, and it is our responsibility as a society to ensure that the story is one of fair labor and human respect, not one of cages and metal pipes. The women of Dewusa are no longer whispering. Their voices have become a permanent part of the American legal and moral landscape. The final image of this story is not the rusted fence or the empty factory floor, but the sight of a free woman walking down a street in a bustling American city. Her head held high and her future her own. She's no longer a number on a production quota or a debtor to a predatory broker. She is a survivor who fought a king in his castle and won. The silence of the Pacific has been broken by the roar of justice, and while the scars of the past remain, the light of the future is bright. The Dewusa case is a story of darkness, yes, but it is ultimately a story of the light that follows. It is a story that reminds us that as long as there are people willing to speak the truth and a system willing to listen, the fortresses of exploitation will always, eventually, come crumbling down. The journey from Pago Pago to the mainland was long and filled with pain, but it was a journey toward the truth. A truth that now stands as a permanent guardian for all those who still labor in the shadows of the world's indifference. We listen to this story not just to remember the victims, but to ensure that we are never again the silent audience to such a tragedy. The legacy of Dewusa is our shared responsibility to look closer, to listen harder, and to never let the vastness of the ocean hide the humanity of our fellow man. The passage of time has a peculiar way of smoothing over the sharpest edges of history, turning visceral trauma into a series of detached footnotes in legal textbooks. But for those who lived through the era of the Dewusa factory, time is not a healer so much as it is a witness to the enduring nature of their survival. As we stand in the year 2026, nearly 3 decades removed from the initial arrival of those 250 hopeful Vietnamese women on the shores of American Samoa, the case has moved into its final stage of historical synthesis. The physical factory is gone, its walls surrendered to the encroaching jungle, and its machines sold for scrap. But the metaphysical weight of what happened in Pago Pago continues to exert a profound influence on the global conscience. The case of Kill Suli remains the definitive template for understanding the dark underbelly of the modern global economy, a stark reminder that as long as there are borders, loopholes, and a desperate human need for work, the threat of modern slavery will remain an ever-present shadow. It is in this final reflection that we must look beyond the verdict and the prison sentences to understand the true, lasting cost of the American dream when it is weaponized against the very people who believe in it most fervently. The survivors of Dewusa, now settled into their middle and late years in various corners of the United States mainland, represent a living bridge between a world of absolute exploitation and one of hard-won freedom. Many of these women have now spent more time in America as free citizens than they ever did as captives, Yet the memories of the compound in Pago Pago remain remarkably vivid. For many, the simple act of grocery shopping or buying a new piece of clothing is still filtered through the trauma of the rice and cabbage diet and the sewing machines that never stopped. There is a generational shift occurring now, as the children of these survivors reach adulthood, growing up as fully integrated Americans with no direct memory of the barbed wire or the metal pipes. These children are the true fruit of their mother's sacrifice, the living realization of the dream that was nearly extinguished in a South Pacific labor camp. They carry the stories of their mothers as a sacred trust, a family history that is both a source of immense pride and a reminder of the fragility of human dignity. In this sense, the victory over Kill Sully is not just found in his 40-year prison sentence, but in the college graduations, the first-time home purchases, and the quiet, ordinary lives of the descendants of the Dewusa women. The legal architecture of the United States has also been permanently reshaped by the echoes of Pago Pago. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was birthed in the wake of this scandal, has evolved into a sophisticated global tool for human rights enforcement. The lessons learned in the Dewusa investigation, the importance of victim-centered approaches, the necessity of language access, and the deep understanding of psychological coercion have been exported to law enforcement agencies around the world. The case forced the Department of Justice to develop specialized units that specifically target the financial structures of human trafficking, recognizing that to truly dismantle a slave operation, one must follow the money as closely as the victims. While Kill Sully was successful in hiding much of his wealth, his failure to evade the 40-year sentence remains a powerful deterrent. It sent a message to the global business community that the American flag provides no sanctuary for those who would trade in human lives. The legacy of the case is found in every successful trafficking prosecution that has followed. A continuous line of justice that leads back to the brave women who first hid letters in the pockets of their sewn garments. However, we must also confront the reality that the world of 2026 still harbors many dark corners where the spirit of Kill Sully continues to thrive. The global supply chain has only grown more complex and fragmented since the late 90s, creating new layers of anonymity for predatory employers. While American Samoa's loopholes have been closed, other jurisdictions and special economic zones across the globe continue to offer the same dangerous combination of isolated geography and weak labor oversight. The lessons of Dewusa are a constant warning that the price of consumer comfort is often a hidden human cost. We live in an age where information is instantaneous, yet the origins of the products we use every day are often more opaque than ever. The hidden letters of the Dewusa workers were an analog solution to a timeless problem, but in the digital age, the pleas for help are often drowned out by the noise of the internet. The case remains a call for a more conscious form of consumerism, one that demands transparency and accountability from the global brands that dominate our lives. The fate of Kill Sully himself provides a somber bookend to the narrative of his rise and fall. From his perspective, he was a victim of a changing political landscape and a legal system that failed to understand the realities of international business. In the quiet of his federal prison cell, he has had decades to reflect on the collapse of his Pacific empire. The man who once viewed himself as a sovereign king on a tropical island is now just another aging inmate in the vast machinery of the American penal system. His story is a classic arc of hubris, a cautionary tale of a man who believed his personal ambition was exempt from the moral laws of humanity. The 40-year sentence was not just a punishment for his specific crimes, but a symbolic rejection of his entire philosophy of exploitation. As he nears the end of his life in custody, the world he tried to build has been entirely erased, replaced by the very laws and protections he sought to circumvent. His legacy is one of infamy, his name forever associated with one of the most egregious violations of human rights in modern American history. The island of American Samoa has moved forward with a sense of quiet determination to never repeat the mistakes of the past. The local government and the community of Pago Pago have worked to rebuild their reputation, emphasizing the traditional Samoan values of respect and community over the hollow promises of unregulated industrial growth. The memory of the factory is still there, held by the older generation who remember the sight of the women in the village and the sudden arrival of the federal agents. There is a sense of collective healing, a recognition that the shame of the past belongs to the perpetrators, not to the land or the people who eventually helped the victims escape. The island remains a place of profound beauty, its volcanic peaks and deep blue waters standing in stark contrast to the darkness of the Dewusa story. It is a reminder that even in the most beautiful places, the capacity for human cruelty exists, and that the only defense against it is a community that is willing to look out for the most vulnerable among them. As we bring this long and detailed investigation to a close, we are left with the image of the Pacific Ocean, that vast and indifferent expanse that both hides and connects us. The story of Dewusa is a story of the ocean of people crossing it in search of a better life, of letters floating across it in search of justice, and of a legal system that eventually crossed it to bring an end to a nightmare. It is a story that reminds us of our shared humanity and our collective responsibility to one another. The women of Dewusa were not just factory workers. They were the guardians of a truth that the world desperately needed to hear. Their courage changed the law, changed the industry, and changed the lives of everyone who has ever learned of their ordeal. They proved that no matter how isolated the location or how powerful the oppressor, the human spirit has an irrepressible need for freedom that can never be fully extinguished. In the final accounting, the Dewusa case is a testament to the power of the individual voice. It began with a single worker who refused to be silenced, a single letter hidden in a pocket, and a single brave woman who stood up in a courtroom to show her scarred face to the world. These individual acts of defiance, when joined together, became an unstoppable force for justice. They remind us that we are never truly powerless as long as we have the courage to speak the truth and the empathy to listen to the truth of others. The legacy of the 250 Vietnamese workers is a beacon of hope for all those who still labor in the dark, a promise that the world is watching and that justice, however delayed, is possible. We honor their survival not just by telling their story, but by carrying their vigilance forward into our own lives and our own choices. The silence of the old factory site in Tagapago is no longer the silence of secrets and hidden pain. It is the silence of peace, a peace that was earned through years of struggle and the unwavering commitment of many dedicated people. The rust and the vines have done their work, and the land has been reclaimed by the island. But the story of what happened there will never be forgotten. It is woven into the fabric of the American story, a permanent reminder of the darkness we are capable of and the light we are capable of bringing to the world. As the waves continue to crash against the shores of American Samoa, they carry with them the echoes of a victory that was won against all odds. It is a victory that belongs to the women of Dewusa, and it is a victory that belongs to all of us who believe in the inalienable right to be free. This series has been an attempt to document that victory in all its complexity and pain, from the initial recruitment in Vietnam to the final verdict in Honolulu. We have followed a trail of evidence that leads from the darkest depths of human greed to the highest peaks of human resilience. We hope that by listening to this story, you have gained a deeper understanding of the world we live in and the responsibilities we share. The case of Kill Suli is a closed chapter in the legal sense, but its lessons are more relevant today than ever. Let us carry those lessons with us as we move forward, ensuring that the silence of the Pacific is never again used to hide the cries of the exploited. Let us remember the names and the faces of those who suffered, and let us honor them by standing up for justice wherever we find it. The story of Dewusa is a story of the American dream, but it is also a story of the American reality. It is up to all of us to ensure that the dream remains a reality for everyone, regardless of where they come from or what that they carry. Thank you for traveling this long and difficult road with us. The lights of the courtroom have gone out, and the factory gates are closed forever, but the truth remains a permanent and steady flame in the darkness. The concept of a ghost is often associated with the lingering spirit of a person who has passed away, but in the humid, volcanic air of American Samoa, there exists a different kind of haunting. It is the ghost of a place, a specific geographical memory of a facility that no longer exists but continues to exert a heavy, invisible pressure on the collective consciousness of the island. When you walk past the empty lot in the village of Pago Pago where the Dewusa factory once stood, the silence is not merely a lack of noise. It is an active, heavy presence. The lush tropical greenery has successfully buried the physical evidence of the sewing machines and the razor wire. But it cannot bury the structural trauma that was woven into the very soil of the territory. This haunting is not just localized to the South Pacific. It radiates outward, following the flight paths that the survivors took when they finally left the island for the American mainland. It exists in the quiet suburban streets of Seattle, in the bustling Vietnamese markets of Orange County, and in the small, tightly knit immigrant communities of the Midwest. This final chapter of our investigation is not about the trial or the sentence, but about the slow, persistent, and often quiet process of human restoration and the realization that for some crimes, there is no such thing as a clean break from the past. The restoration of a human soul after years of systemic abuse is a process that defies the linear timelines favored by the legal system. When the survivors of Dewusa were granted their T visas and began their lives on the mainland, many believed that the simple act of being in a free environment would be the primary catalyst for their healing. However, as specialized trauma counselors and social workers quickly discovered, the invisible cage that Kill Suli had constructed around these women was not made of chain link fence, but of a profound conditioned terror. Years after the factory was closed, many survivors still found it impossible to sit with their backs to a door or to eat a full meal without a lingering sense of guilt or a fear that the food might be taken away. The psychological architecture of the factory floor had been internalized, a mental blueprint where every authority figure was a potential predator and every colleague was a competitor for survival. Healing required more than just a change of scenery. It required a total dismantling of that internal blueprint and the slow, agonizing reconstruction of a sense of self-worth that had been systematically eroded by starvation and violence. This process was often invisible to the outside world, taking place in quiet therapy rooms and around kitchen tables where the women slowly learned to tell their stories not as victims of a crime, but as survivors of a war. For the Vietnamese diaspora in the United States, the arrival of the Dewusa survivors was a moment of profound communal reflection. The existing Vietnamese communities, many of whom had their own histories of migration and trauma following the war, recognized in these women a familiar kind of resilience. They provided the essential social scaffolding that the federal government could not, offering language support, cultural familiarity, and the simple but transformative power of a shared meal. In cities across America, these women began to integrate into the mundane rhythms of American life, finding work in nail salons, grocery stores, and hospitality services. They became mothers and grandmothers, their identities slowly expanding far beyond the narrow, suffocating definition of a trafficking victim. Yet, even in the middle of a 4th of July celebration or a Lunar New Year festival, the shadow of the Pacific remained. Many survivors found that they could not wear certain types of clothing or walk past a garment shop without feeling a sudden, sharp pang of anxiety. The products of their industry, the very things they had spent years sewing under the threat of a metal pipe, became permanent triggers. A physical reminder that their freedom had been purchased at an unimaginable cost. In the year 2026, the perspective on the Dewusa case has shifted from a shocking anomaly to a foundational case study in the global fight against human exploitation. The world is now more connected than ever, but the mechanisms of recruitment and debt bondage have evolved to become even more sophisticated and difficult to detect. The recruitment brokers in rural Vietnam, the same types of men who originally lured the women to Pago Pago with false promises of prosperity, have not disappeared. They have simply adapted their tactics to the digital age, using social media and encrypted messaging to find the next generation of desperate dreamers. This persistent reality is perhaps the most frustrating legacy of the case. It reminds us that while we can prosecute an individual like Kill Suli, we have not yet dismantled the global economic conditions that make his brand of cruelty profitable. The survivors of Dewusa understand this better than anyone, and many have become quiet advocates within their own communities, warning others of the dangers that hide behind the glossy brochures of overseas employment. Their voices, once silenced by the noise of industrial machines, are now the most effective early warning system we have against the return of the Dewusa model. The legal evolution triggered by the case has reached its maturity in 2026. With the Trafficking Victims Protection Act now standing as one of the most robust pieces of human rights legislation in the world. The lessons learned from the specific failures in American Samoa have led to a more integrated approach to federal oversight in all United States territories. The Department of Labor and the Department of Justice now maintain a continuous, proactive presence in these isolated regions, ensuring that the geographical distance from Washington no longer translates into a distance from the law. This structural change is a direct result of the evidence gathered during the Dewusa investigation, a permanent monument to the women who were brave enough to hide letters in their pockets. However, the struggle for financial restitution remains a somber and unfinished chapter. The millions of dollars that Kilsuli successfully hid before his conviction have never been fully recovered, leaving a lingering sense of economic injustice. While the women have their freedom and their citizenship, the money that was stolen from their families remains a void, a final, cynical act of defiance from a man who chose profit over humanity. The question of what it means to be free is one that the Dewusa survivors have had to answer every day of their lives since leaving the island. Freedom is not merely the absence of a guard or a fence. It is the ability to choose one's own path, to speak one's own language without fear, and to look toward the future without the crushing weight of an impossible debt. For the women who endured the nightmare in Pago Pago, freedom is a daily practice, a quiet commitment to living a life of dignity in the face of a past that tried to strip it away. As they age, their stories are being passed down to their children and grandchildren, becoming a part of the American mosaic. They are a reminder that the American dream is not a gift, but something that is often fought for in the most desperate of circumstances. The success of their children, the doctors, teachers, and business owners who now carry the names of the Dewusa survivors is the ultimate and most definitive answer to the cruelty of Kilsuli. His attempt to turn these women into disposable industrial assets failed utterly, replaced by a legacy of human flourishing that he could never have imagined and can never touch. The empty lot in Pago Pago may be silent, and the ruins of the factory may be buried under the jungle, but the story of Dewusa is more relevant today than ever. It serves as a permanent checkpoint for our collective morality, a case that forced us to define where we draw the line between global commerce and human rights. It reminds us that the Made in the USA label is not just a marketing tool, but a promise of ethical standards that must be defended with constant vigilance. The case proved that no matter how vast the ocean or how isolated the territory, the eyes of justice will eventually find those who seek to exploit the vulnerable. The silence of the Pacific is no longer a shield for predators. It is a space where the voices of the brave have finally been heard and amplified across the world. The investigation into the Dewusa factory is officially closed, but the work of protecting the dignity of every worker, regardless of where they labor or what language they speak, is a task that will never be finished. As we conclude this long-form narrative, we are left with the image of the sunset over the Pacific, a view that once symbolized captivity for the women of Dewusa, but now symbolizes the vastness of their possibilities. The ocean that once separated them from their homes and their safety is now the same ocean that connects them to a world where they are finally, undeniably free. Their journey from the darkness of a locked compound in 1998 to the light of a free life in 2026 is one of the great untold epics of modern American history. It is a story of how the most marginalized people can stand up to a powerful predator and, through their collective courage, change the laws of a nation. We remember their struggle not just to honor the past, but to protect the future. The ghosts of Dewusa are no longer a haunting of terror. They are a haunting of conscience. A steady and unwavering reminder that we must never again allow the noise of industry to drown out the voice of humanity. The factory is gone, the fence is rusted, and the survivors are free. The case is closed, but the lessons of Dewusa remain written into the laws of the land and the hearts of all those who believe that every human life is of infinite and inalienable value. As the final echoes of the Dewusa trial faded from the sterile courtrooms of Honolulu and the heavy iron gates of federal prison slammed shut behind Kill Suli, the world largely moved on to other headlines, other scandals, and other tragedies. But for the 250 women who had survived the sweltering nightmare of Pago Pago, and for the legal system that had been forced to confront its own darkest loopholes, there was no simple way to close the book. The conclusion of a legal case is often mistaken for the conclusion of a human story. Yet in the world of true crime and investigative narrative, the verdict is merely a comma, not a period. To look back at the Dewusa legacy from the vantage point of 2026 is to realize that the case did not just change the law. It fundamentally altered the moral geography of the United States and its relationship with its distant, isolated territories. The story of Kill Suli remains a haunting reminder that justice is not a static state of being, but a continuous, often exhausting struggle against the persistent shadows of human greed. The final fate of Kill Suli himself provides a stark and somber meditation on the nature of accountability. By 2026, the man who once commanded a private industrial fortress in the South Pacific has spent over 2 decades in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The arrogance that defined his reign at Dewusa, the belief that he was a sovereign entity untouchable by the laws of the mainland, has been systematically dismantled by the cold, bureaucratic reality of a life sentence in all but name. He is now an old man, his once formidable influence reduced to the narrow confines of a prison cell, far removed from the tropical heat and the roar of the sewing machines. His incarceration stands as a permanent, high-profile rejection of the idea that American territories can be used as lawless zones for exploitation. Yet, even in his forced retirement from the world of commerce, Lee remains a symbol of the narcissistic drive that views human lives as mere inputs in a financial ledger. His name is now a shorthand for a specific type of modern villainy, a cautionary tale taught in law schools and human rights seminars to illustrate the terrifying potential of unchecked power in isolated places. However, the true measure of the Dewusa legacy is not found in the cell of the perpetrator, but in the kitchens and living rooms of the survivors who chose to make the United States their permanent home. For these women, the transition from victims to citizens was a metamorphosis that required a level of courage that few can truly comprehend. By 2026, many of the original workers have lived in America longer than they ever lived in Vietnam. They have become the quiet, resilient backbone of their communities, their identities no longer defined by the trauma of the factory floor, but by the ordinary successes of their lives. They are the mothers who watch their children graduate from American universities, the grandmothers who tell stories of a distant island not as a place of terror, but as the crucible where their strength was forged. The T-visas that were once a fragile lifeline have long since been converted into citizenship, a final, definitive victory over the man who tried to steal their passports and their futures. Their presence in the American mosaic is a living rebuke to the system that once allowed them to be treated as property. Yet, we must also reflect on the shadows that still linger, the parts of the story that justice could not fully reach. The $1.8 million in court-ordered restitution remains a ghost of a promise, a debt that Kill Suli successfully evaded through the cynical dispersal of his assets. For many of the survivors, this missing money is not just a financial loss. It is a lingering symbol of the ways in which the legal system can be outmaneuvered by the very criminals it seeks to punish. While the women found their freedom, the financial chains that originally led them to Pago Pago were never fully dismantled by the court. Some families in Vietnam still carry the echoes of those original recruitment loans, an intergenerational burden that reminds us that the reach of a trafficker extends far beyond the walls of a factory. The inability to recover these stolen wages is a significant, sobering flaw in the narrative of justice. A reminder that the pursuit of financial accountability is often much more difficult than the pursuit of a criminal conviction. The physical site of the Dewusa factory in American Samoa has, by 2026, been almost entirely reclaimed by the relentless march of the tropical landscape. The village of Pago Pago has grown and changed, and for many of the younger residents, the story of the garment factory is a half-remembered legend from a previous generation. But for those who remember the raid, the site remains a hallowed and haunted space. The jungle has a way of hiding the scars of the earth, covering the rusted iron and the broken concrete with a blanket of green. But it cannot erase the memory of the cries that were once drowned out by the noise of the machines. The silence of the old factory lot is a heavy, meaningful silence, a space where the territory of American Samoa had to confront its own role in the tragedy. The case forced a painful but necessary period of self-reflection on the island, leading to a renewed commitment to the protection of labor rights and a rejection of the isolationist policies that allowed Lee to operate in the dark for so long. In the broader context of global human rights, the Dewusa case stands as the foundational document for the modern fight against forced labor. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was birthed from the shock of this specific scandal, has been updated and strengthened multiple times since the year 2000. In 2026, federal investigators have tools and resources that were unimaginable to the agents who first breached the gates of Dewusa. The lessons of Pago Pago, the importance of victim testimony, the need to look behind the Made in USA label, and the recognition of psychological coercion as a form of slavery are now the standard operating procedures for anti-trafficking units worldwide. The case proved that the law must be as mobile and as global as the criminals it pursues, and that no territory is too remote for the reach of justice. The hidden letters of the Dewusa workers became the blueprint for a new era of transparency, forcing corporations to take responsibility for the human lives woven into their supply chains. As we conclude this deep dive into one of the most significant true crime stories in American history, we are left to consider the concept of the Made in USA label. Before Dewusa, that label was a simple symbol of quality and domestic production. After Dewusa, it became a reminder that ethics are not guaranteed by geography alone. The case taught us that the price of our goods is often hidden in the silence of those who produce them, and that as consumers and citizens, we have a moral obligation to listen for the voices that are being suppressed. The women of Dewusa spoke to us through letters hidden in pockets, through frantic escapes into the jungle, and through their unflinching testimony in a federal courtroom. They forced us to look at a reality we preferred to ignore, and in doing so, they made the world a slightly more just and transparent place. Their legacy is not just a legal one. It is a humanitarian one, a testament to the fact that even in the most isolated corners of the earth, the human spirit cannot be permanently caged. The story of Kilsuli and the Dewusa factory is a journey from the darkness of a Pacific fortress to the light of a Honolulu courtroom, and finally to the quiet, dignified lives of the survivors. It is a story of how a legal loophole was used to build a kingdom of misery, and how that kingdom was eventually dismantled by the full force of a nation's conscience. As the sun sets over the harbor of Pago Pago in 2026, the water remains as blue and indifferent as it ever was, but the island is different. It is a place that has looked into the abyss and chosen a better path. The survivors, scattered across the American mainland, are no longer the terrified women who arrived on that tarmac in 1998. They are the architects of their own liberation, the guardians of a history that must never be forgotten. They are the living proof that justice, though often slow and imperfect, is a force that can cross any ocean and break any chain. In the final analysis, we listen to stories like Dewusa not to satisfy a morbid curiosity, but to honor the resilience of those who survived and to ensure that their suffering was not in vain. The case of Kilsuli is a closed file in the Department of Justice, but it remains an open lesson for humanity. It tells us that we must never stop looking for the hidden letters, never stop listening for the muffled cries, and never assume that the distance of an ocean makes someone else's tragedy any less our own. The letters that were once tucked into the seams of garments were eventually found, and the truth they contained changed everything. As we move forward into an increasingly complex and globalized future, let us carry the vigilance of those federal agents and the courage of those Vietnamese workers with us. Let us remember that the true strength of a nation is not found in the profits of its industry, but in the protections it affords to the least of its people. The investigation is over. The machines have stopped. The survivors are home. The story of Dewusa is a monument to the fact that even in the deepest silence of the Pacific, the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface. It is a reminder that while one man tried to build a prison on a tropical island, he instead built a legacy of reform that continues to save lives today. The ocean is vast, and its secrets are many, but the story of the 250 women who reclaimed their lives from the shadows of Pago Pago will remain a steady, guiding light for all those who believe that every human being is born to be free. Their journey is a testament to the enduring power of hope, the necessity of justice, and the unbreakable spirit of the human heart. We sign off from this narrative with a final, somber respect for the survivors, whose names may not all be known, but whose impact on the world will be felt for generations to come. The case is concluded, but the vigilance continues. In the quiet of the Pacific night, the ghosts of the old factory have finally found their peace, and the light of justice remains a permanent fixture on the horizon. Thank you for listening to the long, difficult, and ultimately triumphant story of the Dewusa legacy. The structural silence of the Pacific Ocean is a phenomenon that extends far beyond the physical absence of sound. It is a profound, systemic vacuum that allows for the erasure of human presence and the suspension of the standard moral compass. In this 11th chapter of our deep dive into the Dewusa tragedy, we must confront the uncomfortable reality that Sully did not simply find a loophole in the law. He discovered a loophole in human empathy. The geographical isolation of American Samoa acted as a biological filter, straining out the noise of the outside world until the only voice that remained was the one that commanded the production line. As we look back from the year 2026, it is essential to understand that the factory in Pago Pago was a living experiment in the limits of human endurance, a place where the social contract was not merely breached, but entirely rewritten to serve the narcissistic whims of a single individual. The story of Dewusa is, at its most fundamental level, a story about the danger of invisibility and the terrifying ease with which an entire community can be convinced to look away from a horror that is occurring right in front of them. It is a narrative that forces us to examine the mechanics of complicity and the silent, grinding gears of a global economy that values the consistency of a stitch over the integrity of a life. The technical and forensic challenges faced by the federal investigators in the months following the raid were as immense and daunting as the physical rescue itself. Building a case that could withstand the scrutiny of a federal court required more than just the heartbreaking testimony of the victims. It required a meticulous, microscopic reconstruction of the factory's financial and administrative machinery. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Labor had to untangle a web of deceptive accounting, forged contracts, and illicit money transfers that stretched across the Pacific, through various Asian banking centers, and into the heart of the American mainland. Investigators spent thousands of agonizing hours reviewing seized shipping manifests, payroll records, and the confiscated Vietnamese and Chinese passports that had been used as instruments of control. They had to prove that the starvation was not a result of logistical failures on a remote island, but a deliberate, calculated strategy to minimize costs and maximize control. This forensic accounting was a slow, grueling process of turning thousands of fragments of paper into a coherent, undeniable narrative of criminal intent. Every forged signature on an illegal labor contract and every manipulated deduction from a worker's meager wage was a brick in the wall of evidence that would eventually trap Sully. The investigative team had to become experts in the specific nuances of the garment industry, understanding how production quotas and shipping deadlines were used as weapons of psychological warfare against the captive workforce. Furthermore, the investigation had to navigate the complex and often resistant cultural landscape of American Samoa, where the traditional social structures of the village and the family often collided with the rigid requirements of federal law. The agents had to earn the trust of a local population that was often skeptical of mainland authorities and protective of the economic stability that the factory supposedly provided. This required a delicate balance of diplomacy and firm legal action. as investigators worked to identify who in the local government had known about the abuse and who had actively helped to facilitate it. The discovery of bribery and corruption at the local level added another layer of complexity to the case, revealing that Kilsuli's empire of suffering was supported by a network of local enablers who had prioritized their own financial gain over the safety of the foreign workers. This aspect of the investigation was perhaps the most sensitive, as it touched upon the delicate political relationship between the territory and the federal government. It highlighted the profound vulnerabilities of the insular legal system, showing how easily a powerful outsider could manipulate the local infrastructure to create a zone of absolute impunity. The agents were not just investigating a factory. They were investigating the failure of a government to protect the most vulnerable people within its jurisdiction. The biological toll on the survivors, as documented by medical experts during the preparation for the trial, provided some of the most harrowing evidence of the regime's cruelty. The systemic malnutrition was not merely a matter of hunger. It was a deliberate stripping away of the workers' physical autonomy. Doctors found that the long-term consumption of nothing but rice and cabbage had led to severe cases of anemia, muscular atrophy, and chronic vitamin deficiencies that would plague the women for the rest of their lives. Many of the survivors suffered from permanent damage to their internal organs and skeletal systems, a direct result of the grueling 14-hour work shifts performed under the weight of severe caloric deficits. The psychological evaluations were even more disturbing, revealing a level of complex post-traumatic stress that mirrored the conditions seen in survivors of wartime labor camps. The workers had been kept in a state of constant, low-level hypervigilance, their nervous systems permanently altered by the proximity of violence and the total absence of safety. These medical and psychological findings were essential for the prosecution, as they provided the empirical proof of the extreme cruelty required to justify the lengthy prison sentence for Kilsuli. They transformed the abstract legal charges into a concrete, undeniable record of physical and mental destruction, ensuring that the jury understood the full, devastating human cost of every dollar that Lee had squeezed out of his operation. In Vietnam, the ripple effects of the Daewoo case triggered a profound and lasting shift in the way the government managed the export of its labor force. The stories of the women who returned from American Samoa, often in a state of physical and mental collapse, became a national scandal that could not be ignored by the authorities in Hanoi. The case forced a total reevaluation of the broker system that had traditionally governed the recruitment of Vietnamese workers for overseas jobs. New laws were enacted to increase the oversight of recruitment agencies, requiring them to provide more transparent contracts and to assume greater responsibility for the safety of the workers they sent abroad. The Vietnamese government began to view labor export not just as an economic strategy, but as a matter of national dignity and citizen protection. This shift was a direct result of the international attention brought to the Daewoo case, which had exposed the profound vulnerabilities of migrant workers in the global supply chain. The survivors, through their courage in speaking out, had inadvertently become the catalysts for a major reform of the Vietnamese labor system, providing a layer of protection for the millions of workers who followed in their footsteps. Their trauma had been transformed into a legal and administrative shield, a legacy of safety that continues to influence the lives of Vietnamese laborers across the globe today. The philosophical implications of the Daewoo case continue to challenge our understanding of the concept of modern slavery in a globalized world. It forces us to recognize that the absence of physical chains does not equal the presence of freedom. Kilsuli's genius, if it can be called that, was his ability to use the tools of modern capitalism, contracts, debts, and shipping schedules to recreate the conditions of a 19th century plantation. He understood that in a world of global finance, a debt can be just as restrictive as an iron shackle, and the fear of financial ruin for one's family can be just as paralyzing as the fear of a whip. The case serves as a permanent, chilling reminder that slavery is not a relic of the past, but a persistent and adaptable human instinct that will always seek out the newest and most effective methods of exploitation. It challenges the consumer to think about the ancestry of the products they buy, Recognizing that every item has a history and that some of those histories are written in the blood and sweat of the invisible people who work at the edges of our perception. The Dewusa factory was a localized tragedy, but the conditions that allowed it to exist are woven into the very fabric of our global economic system, requiring a constant and collective effort to identify and dismantle them wherever they appear. As we stand in the year 2026, the site of the old factory in Pago Pago has become a place of quiet, tropical reflection, a silent memorial to a struggle that almost no one saw while it was happening. The jungle has done its work, the rust has claimed the wire, and the survivors have built new lives in a country that once allowed them to be enslaved. But the story remains unfinished in the sense that the struggle for true, universal labor dignity is a task that has no final conclusion. The Daewoo case is our North Star in this struggle, a clear and uncompromising point of reference that tells us exactly what is at stake when we allow human beings to become invisible. It is a story that begins with a brochure and ends with a 40-year prison sentence. But its most important chapter is the one that is written every time a consumer asks a question, every time a worker is protected by a law, and every time the silence of the Pacific is broken by the voice of the exploited. We listen to this story not because it is comfortable, but because it is necessary. It is the fuel for our vigilance and the foundation of our empathy. The legacy of the 250 women of Dewusa is not a legacy of victimhood, but a legacy of profound, transformative power. They changed the law, they changed the industry, and they changed our understanding of what it means to be human in a world that often tries to treat us as things. The final image of this narrative is not the rusted fence or the empty lot, but the vision of the ocean that connects Vietnam, American Samoa, and the United States mainland. That ocean was once a barrier of silence, but it is now a bridge of memory. It carries the stories of the letters in the pockets, the escapes in the dark, and the testimony in the courtroom. It reminds us that no one is truly alone as long as their story is told and their struggle is remembered. The Dewusa case is a permanent part of the American story, a reminder of the darkness we are capable of and the light we are capable of bringing to the world. As we close this extensive investigation, we do so with a profound respect for the survivors and a renewed commitment to the principles of justice and dignity that they fought so hard to reclaim. The machines have stopped, the factory is gone, and the survivors are free. The case is closed, but the lesson is eternal. The truth, like the tide, will always find its way to the shore, no matter how long it takes or how far it has to travel. Thank you for being a witness to this history, for listening to the whispers from the dark, and for helping to ensure that the silence of the Pacific is never again the silence of the forgotten. The story of Dewusa is a story for all of us, a reminder that the price of freedom is a burden we must all share, and that the light of justice is a fire we must all work to keep burning, now and forever.